Chapter 12 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 12 The Breaking of the Storm. The master of Lonely Ranch was seated before the table in his unpretentious sitting room. Before him were piled a number of open account books, and books containing matters relating to the business of his ranch. He was not looking at them now, but sat gazing at the blank wall in front of him with thoughtful, introspective eyes. His chin was resting upon his clenched hands, and his elbows were propped upon the table. He was sitting with his shirt sleeves rolled up above his elbows, for the day was hot and the air was close and heavy. On one hand the window was wide open, but no jarring sounds came in to disturb the thinker. The door on the other side was also open wide. George Iredale showed no desire for secrecy. His attitude was that of a man who feels himself to be perfectly safeguarded against any sort of surprise. Thus he sat in the quiet of the oppressive heat, thinking of many things which chiefly concerned his life in the valley of Owl Hoot. He had been going over the accounts which represented his 15 years of labour in that quiet corner of the great Dominion, and the perusal had given him a world of satisfaction. 15 years ago he had first settled in the valley. He had acquired the land for a mere song, for no one would look at the region of Owl Hoot as a district suitable either for stock raising or for the cultivation of grain. But he had seen possibilities in the place, possibilities which had since been realized even beyond his expectations. His sense of humour was tickled as he thought of the cattle he had first brought to the ranch, a herd of old cows which he had picked up cheap somewhere out west at the foot of the Rockies. He almost laughed aloud as he thought of the way in which he had fostered and added to the weird, stupid legends of the place, and how he had never failed to urge the undesirability of his neighbourhood for any sort of agriculture. And thus for 15 years he had kept the surrounding country clear of inquisitive settlers. Life had been very pleasant, quiet, monotonous, and profitable for him, and, as he thought of it all, his eyes drooped again to his books before him, and he gazed upon a sea of entries in a long, thick, narrow volume which bore on the cover the legend Opium. Yes, he never attempted to disguise from himself the nature of his calling. He plastered neither himself nor his trade with thick coatings of whitewash. He knew what he was, and faced the offensive title with perfect equanimity. He was a smuggler, probably the largest operator in the illicit traffic of opium smuggling, and the most successful importer of Chinese along the whole extent of the American border. He knew that the penitentiary was yearning for him, and he knew that every moment of his life was shadowed by the threat of penal servitude. And in the meantime he was storing up his wealth, not in driblets dependent upon the season for their extent, but in huge sums which were proportionate to the risks he was prepared to run. And his risks had been many, and his escapes narrow and frequent. But he had hitherto evaded the law, and now the time had come when he intended to throw it all up, to blot out at one sweep the traces of those 15 prosperous years, and settle down to enjoy the proceeds of his toil. It was only after much thought and after months of deliberation that he had arrived at this decision. For this man revelled in his calling with an enthusiasm which was worthy of an honest object. He was not a man whose natural inclinations leant towards law-breaking, far from it. Outside of his trade he lived a cleaner life than many a so-called law-abiding citizen. The risks he ran, the excitement of contraband trade, had a fatal fascination which was as the breath of life to him, a fascination which, with all his strength of mind in every other direction, he was as powerless to resist as were the consumers powerless to resist the fascinations of the drug he purveyed. But now he stood face to face with a contingency he had never taken into his considerations. He had fallen victim to a man's passion for a woman, and he had been forced to a choice between the two things. Either he must renounce all thoughts of Prudence Malling, or he must marry her and break from all his old associations. To a man of Iredale's disposition the two things were quite incompatible. The steady growth of his love for this girl, a love which absorbed all that was best in his deep, strong nature, had weighed heavily in the balance, and reluctant though the master of Lonely Ranch was to sever himself from the traffic which had afforded him so much wealth and so many years of real, living moments, his decision had been taken with calm deliberation. The fiat had gone forth. Henceforth the traffic in yellow would know him no more. He rose from his seat and, crossing the room, stood gazing out of the open window. Finally his eyes were turned up towards the heavy banking of storm clouds which hovered low over the valley. Already the greater portion of his plans had been carefully laid. They had been costly for many reasons. His agents were men who required to be dealt with liberally. However, everything had been satisfactorily settled. Now only remained the disposal of the ranch. This was rather a delicate matter, for obvious reasons. He wished to effectually obliterate all traces of the traffic he had carried on there. He went to the table and picked up an official-looking letter. It was a communication from Rob Chillingwood, written on the municipal notepaper of Ainsley. He read the letter carefully through. "My dear Mr. Iredale, there is a man named Gordon Duffield stopping at the hotel here, who has lately arrived from Scotland. I have effected the sale of the Dominion Ranch, you know, the German Grieg's old place, to him. He is a man of considerable means, and is going in largely for stock raising. He has commissioned me to buy something like 5,000 head of cows and 2-year-old steers for him. His bulls he brought out with him. You will understand the difficulty I shall have in obtaining such a bunch of suitable animals, and I thought you might have some surplus stock that you wish to dispose of at a reasonable price. You might let me know by return if such is the case, always bearing in mind when you make your quotations that the gentleman hails from Old Scotia. There is shortly to be a great boom in emigration from both the old country and the States, and I am now combining the business of land agent with my other duties, and I find it a paying concern. Let me know about the cattle at your earliest convenience. Yours truly, Rob Chillingwood." Iredale smiled as he read the letter over. "Comes at an opportune moment," he said to himself. "Surplus stock, eh? Well, I think I can offer him all the stock he needs at a price which will meet with the approval of even a canny Scot. I'll write him at once." He seated himself at his table and wrote a long letter, asking Chillingwood to come out and see him, and at the same time offering to dispose of the stock of Lonely Ranch. He sealed the letter, and then returned his account books to their hiding place behind the bookcase. Then he went to the door and summoned his head man. In spite of the habit of years, Iredale was not without a strong sense of relief as he reviewed the progress of the disestablishment of the ranch. He remembered how narrowly he had escaped from Leslie Grey less than a year ago, and now that he had begun to burn his boats, he was eager to get through with the process. The ferret-faced Chintz framed himself in the doorway. "My horse," demanded his master. "And, Chintz, I want you to take this letter to Lakeville and post it with your own hands. You understand?" The little man nodded his head. "Good." Iredale paused thoughtfully. "Chintz," he went on a moment later, "we've finished with opium. We retire into private life from now out, you and I. We are going to leave Owl Hoot. How does that suit you?" The little man cheerfully nodded, and twisted his face into a squinting grimace intended for a pleasant smile. Then his eyebrows went up inquiringly. Iredale took his meaning at once. "I don't know where we are going as yet, but you'll go with me. I want you to remain my head man." Chintz nodded. There could be no doubt from his expression that he was devoted to his master. "Right. Send my horse round at once. I am going to Loon Dyke, and shall be back for supper." The man departed, and the rancher prepared for his ride. When George Iredale set out for Loon Dyke, the valley was shrouded in the gloom of a coming storm. But he knew the peculiarities of the climate too well to be alarmed. The storm, he judged, would not break until nearly sundown, and then it would only be short and sharp. In the meantime he would have reached the farm. There was a curious, unconscious rapidity in his way of settling up his affairs. It was as though some strange power were urging him to haste. This may have been the result of the man's character, for he was of a strikingly vigorous nature. He had put the machinery in motion, and now he primed it with the oil of eager desire to see the work swiftly carried out. As his horse galloped over the prairie, he took the direct route of the crow's flight. His thoughts centred upon the object of his visit. He saw nothing of the pleasant fields and pastures through which his journey took him. The threat of coming storm was nothing to him. For all heed he paid to it, the sky might have been of a tropical blue. The ruffling prairie chicken rose lazily in their coveys, with their crops well filled with the gleanings of the harvested wheat fields. But he scarcely even saw them. All he saw was the sweet, dark face of the girl to whom he intended to put the question which women most love to hear, whether it be put by the man of their choice, or by some one for whom they care not a cent. He had always longed for this day to come, but until now had never seen how such could ever dawn for him. It had been a great wrench to sever himself from the past, but his decision once taken, his heart was filled with thankfulness, and never had he felt so free from care as now. He realized all that a lover may realize of his own unworthiness, but he allowed himself no extravagance of thought in this direction. Prudence was a good woman, he knew, and he intended, if fate so willed, to devote the rest of his life to her happiness. As he drew near to his destination, his heart beat a shade faster, and doubts began to assail him. He found himself speculating upon his chances of success. He believed that the daughter of Hephzibah Malling regarded him with favour, but nothing had gone before to give him any clue to her maiden feelings. He wondered doubtfully, and, in proportion, his nervousness increased. Out upon the trail, at a distance, he saw a horseman riding away from the farm. He did not even trouble about the rider's identity. The strong, reckless nature, concealed beneath his quiet exterior, urged him on to learn his fate. Nothing mattered to him now but his sentence as pronounced by the child of the prairie whose love he sought. There were 3 occupants of the sitting-room at the farm. Prudence and Alice Gordon were at the table, which was covered by a litter of tweed dress material and paper patterns. Prudence was struggling with a maze of skirt folds, under which a sewing machine was almost buried. Alice was cutting and pinning and basting seams at the other end of the table. Sarah Gurridge was standing beside the open window, watching the rising of the storm. Conversation came spasmodically. The girls were intent upon their work. "It's all very well to have new dresses," said Prudence, with an impatient tug at the material on which the machine was operating, "but I'm afraid half the pleasure of them is absorbed by the process of making. Oh, these endless seams! And I don't believe a single one of them is straight. I feel quite hopeless." "Cheer up, Prue," said Alice, without looking up. She herself was endeavouring to set a wristband pattern upon a piece of stuff, so that she could get the 2 bands out of barely enough cloth for one. "You should use more dash when working a machine. When you are turning it, imagine you are driving a through mail to the coast and have to make up time. The seams will come all right." "Yes, and to break cotton and needles, and land the engine over the side of a cut bank, or run down a gang of plate layers or something. There now, I've run clean off the cloth. I wish you wouldn't talk so much." The 2 girls laughed whilst they joined efforts in righting the catastrophe. "Isn't it getting dark?" said Alice, when Prudence had once more settled to work. Sarah spoke without turning from the window. "The storm's banking, child. The lightning is already flashing over Owl Hoot way. Hervey will only just escape it." "What did he want to go over to the ranch for?" asked Prudence. "He never seems to go anywhere else now. I should think Mr. Iredale will get sick of having him always around." "My dear," observed Sarah, with unction, "when 2 men enjoy destroying the harmless life which the good God has set upon the prairie, they never tire of one another's society. Men who would disdain to black a pair of boots would not hesitate to crawl about in the mud and damp reeds of a swamp at daybreak to slaughter a few innocent ducks. There is a bond amongst sportsmen which is stronger than all the vows made at any altar. Hervey's delight in destroying life is almost inhuman. I trust he never shoots sitting game." "I should hope not," said Prudence. "I would never own him as a brother if he did. Hello, Nesh," as the door was pushed slowly open and the great husky limped heavily into the room. The animal looked around him in a dignified, unblinking way, and then came over to Prudence's side and leisurely curled himself up on the skirt of her dress. Say, old boy," she added, looking down at the recumbent form, "if mother comes in and finds you here, you'll leave the room hurriedly." Alice laid her scissors down and looked over at her friend. "Hervey seems quieter than ever lately. He won't even take the trouble to quarrel." "And a good thing, too," said Prudence shortly. Sarah turned and surveyed the two girls for a moment. An amused expression was in her dreamy eyes. Then she turned back to the window as the first distant growl of the coming storm made itself heard. "Hervey only quarrels when his mind is in a state of stagnation. The mind of a man is very like a pool of water. Let it stand, and it corrodes with matter which throws off offensive odours. The longer it stands the worse state it gets into. Set the water in motion, turn it into a running stream, and it at once cleanses itself. Hervey's mind has been lately set in motion. I have noticed the change." "He has certainly become less offensive of late," said Alice. "I wonder what has changed him." "Food for mental occupation," said Sarah. "A life monotonous, unrelieved, breeds selfish discontent, deadening a mind to lofty thought for which by nature meant." Prudence brought the machine to a standstill, and propping one elbow upon the table, rested her chin upon her hand. "I believe you are right, Aunt Sarah," she said slowly. "Hervey's certainly found something which has set him thinking. I rather fancy I know, or can guess, what it is that has roused him." The old lady turned from the window and gazed curiously at her pupil. She was keenly interested. The recreation of her life was the observation of her kind. Her logic and philosophy may not always have been sound, but she never failed to arrive somewhere in the region of the truth. The recent change in Hervey had puzzled her. "He asked me to-day to let him see that notice in the Free Press which appeared when Leslie was murdered," Prudence went on. "He also asked me what Leslie's dying words were. He insisted on the exact words." "The storm will break soon," observed Sarah. She had turned away to the window. "I wonder," said Alice. "Perhaps he has discovered—" She broke off meaningly. "That's what I think," said Prudence. Sarah shook her head, but what she meant to convey was uncertain, for she had her back turned, and she said nothing at the moment. Prudence restarted her machine, and Alice reluctantly bent over her patterns. Sarah moved back from the window. She saw a horseman galloping over the prairie in the direction of the house. She had recognized Iredale. "Girls," she said, her soft eyes turning on Prudence's bent head, "I really think someone should be helping the mother. This is baking day." Prudence looked up with an expression of contrition. "No, no, not you, child. You stay here and get on with your fandangles and dressmaking. I'll go and help her." Without waiting for a reply she darted off. She had no intention of having her innocent little scheme upset. The moment after her departure the clatter of horses' hoofs came in through the open window. Alice, looking up, saw Iredale dismounting from his horse. She jumped up to go to the front door. "Here's Mr. Iredale!" she exclaimed. Then, "So he's returned home. I'm so glad. One scarcely knows the place without him." She dashed out to meet him, and a moment later returned ushering him in. "Mr. George Iredale," she announced with mock ceremony. Then she stood aside to allow him to pass, bowing low as he entered the room. She stood for a moment smiling upon the burly figure. She noted how the plain features lit up at the sight of the girl bending over the sewing machine. Then she gave herself an obvious cue. "I'll go and call Mother Hepsy," she said, and retreated hastily to the bakehouse. Iredale moved over to where Prudence was sitting. She had ceased working to greet him, but she did not rise from the table. Nesh surveyed the intruder, grunted, and closed his eyes again. Prudence was half inclined to resent Alice's sudden departure. Alice was in her confidence. She knew her feelings as regarded George Iredale. She considered her friend's action was unkind. "You mustn't let me disturb you, Prudence," Iredale said in his low, pleasant voice. "What is this?" fingering the material. "A new fall dress? Wonderful how you can cope with the intricacies of the manufacture of such things. It would be a very sorry day for me if I were left to cut my own coats." He laughed nervously. Prudence detected an unusual eagerness in his voice, and something warned her that this man had come over that afternoon to see her alone. She joined in the laugh, but her eyes remained quite serious. "When did you come back from town?" she asked after a pause. "I haven't been to town. I've been across the border. My business took me into Minnesota." "Oh, I thought you had been to Winnipeg." She stooped and caressed the great dog at her feet. Iredale shook his head. A vivid flash of lightning shot across the open window, and a crash of thunder followed it immediately. The storm was breaking at last. "I'll close the window." Iredale moved across the room to do so. Prudence looked after him. When he returned he sat himself in Alice's chair, having brought it nearer to the machine. Then followed a long silence, while the machine rattled down a seam. The man watched the nimble fingers intently as they guided the material under the needle. The bent head prevented him seeing more than the barest outline of the girl's cheek, but he seemed content. Now that the moment had arrived for him to speak, he was quite master of himself. "Prudence," he began at last, "I am giving up my ranch. I have been making the necessary arrangements. I have done with money making." "Really?" The girl looked up sharply, then down again at her work. She had encountered the steady gaze of the man's earnest eyes. "Are you going to leave us?" She was conscious of the lameness of her question. "I don't quite know. That depends largely upon circumstances. I am certainly about to seek pleasant places, but I cannot tell yet where those pleasant places will be found. Perhaps you will help me." "How?" The seam swerved out into a great bow, and Prudence was forced to go back over it. "Easily enough, if you will." The girl did not answer, but busied herself with the manipulation of her machine. Her face had paled, and her heart was thumping in great pulsations. Iredale went on. He had assumed his characteristic composure. What fire burned beneath his calm exterior it would have needed the discerning eyes of Sarah Gurridge to detect, for, beyond the occasional flashing of his quiet grey eyes, there was little or no outward sign. "I have known you for a good many years, child, years which have helped to put a few grey hairs on my head, it is true, but still years which have taught me something which I never dreamed of learning out here on the prairie. They have taught me that such a thing as love exists for every man on this earth, and that somewhere in this world there is a woman who can inspire him with feelings which make the pettinesses of his own solitary existence seem very small indeed. I have learned that man was not made to live alone, but that a certain woman must share his life with him, or that life is an utterly worthless thing. I have learned that there is but one woman in the world who can help me to the better, loftier aspirations of man, and that woman is you, Prudence." The girl had ceased to work and was staring straight in front of her out of the window, where the vivid lightning was now flashing incessantly. As Iredale pronounced the last words, she shook her head slowly, almost helplessly. The man had leaned forward in his chair, and his elbows rested on his parted knees, and his hands were tightly clasped. "Don't shake your head, dear," he went on with persuasive earnestness. "Hear me out first, and then you shall give me your decision. I know I am much older than you, but surely that disparity need not stand in our way. I dare say I have many more years of life yet left than lots of younger men. Besides, I am rich, very rich. With me you can live the life you choose. If you wish to stay here on the prairie, why, you shall have the most perfect farm that money can buy. If, on the other hand, you choose to see the world, you only have to say the word. Prudence, I know I am not a very attractive man. I have little to recommend me, and my life has not always been spent as perhaps it should have been. But I love you very dearly, and my future shall be devoted to your happiness. Will you be my wife?" There was a deafening crash of thunder which seemed to come from directly overhead. The dog started up with a growl. Then he stood looking up into the girl's face. The dying reverberations slowly rolled away and left the room in deathly silence. The serious light in the girl's eyes was augmented by the decided set of her mouth. She kept her face studiously turned from Iredale, who, observing with all the intuitions of a man in deadly earnest, read in her expression something of what his answer was to be. "Do you not care for me sufficiently?" The words contained such a world of appeal that Prudence felt herself forced to turn in his direction. She now looked squarely into his eyes, nor was there the faintest suspicion of embarrassment in her manner. The moment had come when she must choose between herself and her self-imposed duty. She knew that she loved Iredale, but she checked something which sounded very like a sigh. She had listened to the precepts of Sarah Gurridge all her life, and in consequence she had learned to regard her duty before all things. She now conceived she had a great duty to perform. She felt so helpless, so feeble in the matter, but the voice of conscience held her to her mistaken course. "I believe I love you. I am sure I care for you very, very much, but—" "Then you will marry me." The man reached out to take her hand, but she drew it back. His eager eyes shone in the stormy darkness in which the room was bathed. She shook her head. "When Leslie Grey was murdered I made a vow that I would not rest until the murderer was brought to justice. My vow is unfulfilled. I could not marry you and be happy while this is so. Do you know what marriage with you would mean? Simply that I should make no effort to fulfil my vow to the dead. I cannot marry you now." Iredale was staggered by the woeful wrong-mindedness under which he considered she was labouring. For a moment he could scarcely find words to express himself. "But surely, child, you are not going to let this phantom of duty come between us? Oh, you can never do such a thing. Besides, we would work together. We would not leave a stone unturned to discover the wretch who did him to death." He broke off. Prudence answered swiftly, and the set of her face seemed to grow harder as she felt the difficulty of abiding by her resolve. "This is no phantom of duty, George. It is very much a reality. I cannot marry you until— Iredale was smiling now. The shock of the girl's strange decision had passed. He saw something of the motive underlying it. Her sense of duty seemed to have warped her judgment, and with quiet firmness he meant to set it aside. "And this is the only reason for refusing me?" he asked. He had become serious again. He seemed merely to be seeking assurance. "Yes. Oh, George, can't you see how it is?" She gazed appealingly into his face, and the man had to keep a very tight hold upon his feelings. "I am afraid I am a little dense, child," he said gravely. "I must make you understand," Prudence went on with nervous haste. Her conscience urged her forward, whilst her love prompted her to set aside all recollection of the dead, and to bask in the love this man offered her. She was a simple womanly soul, trying with all the strength of her honest purpose to resist the dictates of her love, and to do that which seemed right in her own eyes. The task she had set herself had seemed easy when she had spoken of it to Alice, but now, in the face of this man's love, in the face of her own self-realization, it seemed beyond her strength. "Listen to me, and you will see for yourself that I must not marry you yet. I believe that I loved Leslie Grey truly, fondly. As I look back now, I am sure I did. I was never happy but when I was with him. He seemed so strong and resolute. I never had a moment in which to doubt myself. Then, when he died, the agony I suffered was something too dreadful to contemplate. As he lay on the little bed with his life slowly ebbing, and I watched him dying by inches, I was filled with such horror and despair that I thought surely I should go mad. Then it dawned on me that he had been murdered, and my anguish turned to a dreadful feeling of rage and longing to avenge him. Never in my life did I experience such terrible passion as at that moment. I believe at the time I really was mad. The only thought in my mind was, who has done this thing? Then Leslie died, and in his death agony he spoke and told me, as well as his poor gasping faculties could tell me, what had happened. His words were unintelligible to everyone except me, and those words formed a clue to the assassin's identity. By his bedside I swore to avenge him. Never would I rest until my oath was carried out. As you know, after that I became ill and went away, and, oh, the shame of it! During those months of rest and illness I forgot Leslie Grey. I forgot my vow. I forgot everything that claimed my duty. Think of it, the shame, the shallow heartlessness, the fickle nature which is mine. I, who had loved him as I believed no girl had ever loved, had forgotten him as though he had never come into my life." Iredale nodded comprehensively as the girl paused. "Then you came into my life," Prudence went on. Her face was turned towards the window now, outside of which she saw the tongues of lightning playing across the sky. "Time went on, and slowly something crept into my heart which made me realize my shortcomings. Gradually my conduct was revealed to me in its true colours, and I saw myself as I really was, a heartless, worthless creature, so despicable even to myself as to make me shudder when I contemplated the future. Let me be honest now, at least. I knew that I loved you, George, that is," bitterly, "as far as I was capable of love. But what sort of affection was mine to give to anybody? I could not trust myself. I despised myself. My conscience cried out. Leslie's unavenged death still remained. My vow was still unfulfilled. Knowing this, how could I believe in this new love which had come to me? No, I could not. And it was then that I saw what I must do. Before I could ever dream of love, I must redeem the pledge I made at Leslie's deathbed. That alone could restore my faith in myself. I know that it is almost impossible to convey to you all that I have thought upon the matter, but believe me, I can never marry while Leslie remains unavenged." Tears stood in the girl's eyes as she finished up her curiously twisted self-accusations, and the sincerity of her words was not to be doubted for a moment. Iredale had listened wonderingly, and he marvelled to himself at the wonders of perspective in a woman's mind. "And you are prepared to undertake the matter alone?" "Mother is helping me. It costs money." "Just so. But would not a man's help be of greater importance than your mother's? Don't you think that your husband's assistance might help you far more? That it might be able to lighten the burden of this self-imposed labour? Tut, tut, child. Because of your vow it should not deter you from marriage, especially when your husband is not only ready, but most willing to assist you in clearing up the mystery and avenging Leslie Grey. As regards the quality," with a quiet smile, "of your regard, well, come, you love me, little girl, on your own confession, and if you have no graver scruples than you have offered, then you must marry me." Iredale leant forward and took the girl's two hands in his. This time she made no resistance. She allowed them to rest in his broad palms, and in spite of all her protests felt ineffably happy. At last she drew them away and shook her head weakly. "No, it is no good, George. You must not be burdened with my undertaking. I cannot consent to such a thing. It is only your generosity and kindness which makes you look at the matter so lightly. You would regret your decision later on, and then no, mother and I will see the matter through. We have already secured the services of the smartest detective in Winnipeg, and he is working upon the only clue we possess." "But I insist," said Iredale, with a smile which made his plain features almost handsome. "And, Prue, I am going to tell your mother that you have engaged yourself to me, and that I am a new recruit, fortune as well in the work. No," holding up his hand as the girl was about to protest again, "no objections, sweetheart. And before we go further, tell me of this clue." Prudence smiled happily. She had done her duty. She had laid bare her heart to this man. She had spared herself in no way. She had let him see, she told herself, the sort of girl she was. He still cared for her. He still wished to marry her. She bowed her will to his quiet decision. It is not much to go upon, but, as Dean, that is the detective, says, it is a decided clue. She rose from her seat and walked over to a small work table. At that moment the house shook to its very foundations with a dreadful crash of thunder. Neche, who had moved with her, leapt fiercely at the window as though flying at some invisible enemy. The girl called him to her side. Then she stood trembling. Flash after flash of lightning blazed in the heavens, and she covered her eyes with her hands, whilst the thunder seemed as though it would rend the earth from end to end. Iredale was at her side in an instant, and his arm was about her, and he drew her head upon his shoulder. Instantly her nerve was restored, and as the noise passed she quietly released herself. Then, stooping, she opened the drawer of the table and produced a torn copy of the Winnipeg Free Press. She held out the paper and pointed to the personal column. "See," she said, with her index finger upon the second line of the column. "Yellow booming, slump in grey." Those who are responsible for that message, whatever it may mean, are also responsible for Leslie's death. Iredale's eyes were fixed with a terrible fascination upon the print. A breath escaped him which sounded almost like a gasp. His hands clenched at his sides, and he stood like one turned into stone. "How do you know this?" he asked in a tense, hoarse voice. "Leslie said so with his last dying breath." There came no answering word to the girl's statement. Iredale did not move. His eyes were still upon the paper. The silence of death reigned in the room. Even the storm seemed suddenly to have ceased. Only was there the incessant swish of the torrential rain outside. "That is the clue poor Leslie gave me." "Ah!" "What do you think?" "You must give me time to think." Iredale's mouth was parched. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. For the moment he could scarcely realize his position. An overwhelming horror was upon him. Suddenly he turned. "What is the date of that paper?" "A few days before Leslie's death. But this notice has appeared many times since, which will make our task the easier." "Yes, it will make our task the easier." Another pause, which was protracted until the silence could almost be felt. Then Prudence spoke. "You will stay to tea?" Iredale pulled himself together. "No, I think not. The storm has passed. The rain is ceasing. I had better hurry back home. It will come back on us. The storm, I mean." The girl looked out of the window. "Yes, I think it will. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Hervey went over to see you this afternoon." Iredale's eyes turned sharply upon the girl. "Ah, yes, I will go at once. I will call to morrow and see Mrs. Malling. Good-bye." He turned away and abruptly left the room. Prudence looked after him. She saw him pass out. She saw him go out by the front door and hurry down the little path which bisected the front garden. She saw him go round to the stables, and he seemed not to heed the rain which was still falling lightly. But it was not until she saw him riding away down the trail that she realized the suddenness of his departure, and the fact that he hadn't even attempted to kiss her. Iredale's horse received little consideration at its master's hands on the homeward journey. The animal was ridden almost at racing pace over the long 10 miles of country, and all the way home the words the girl had spoken were running in his ears with maddening insistence. And when we find the author of those words, we find his murderer. She had virtually accused him of murder, for he alone was the author of those words in the paper. Truly, his sins were finding him out. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 13. Blackmail. As Hervey entered the valley of the ranch he listened for the warning owl cries. To-day, however, there were none. He smiled to himself as he noted the fact, for he knew their origin, he knew their object. He understood that these cries were the alarm of sentries stationed at certain points to warn those at the ranch of the approach of strangers. He knew, too, that they were used as signals for other things, and he admired the ingenuity of Iredale in thus turning the natural features of the valley to his own uses. Rain was beginning to fall in great drops, and the thunder of the rising storm had already made itself heard. He urged his horse forward. Few men can embark on a mission of hazard or roguery without some feelings of trepidation, and Hervey was no exception to the rule. He experienced a feeling of pleasurable excitement and anticipation. There was sufficient uncertainty in his mission to make him think hard and review his powers of attack with great regard for detail. There must be no loophole of escape for his victim. On the whole he was well satisfied, but he was not unprepared for failure. During his acquaintance with Iredale he had learned that the master of Lonely Ranch was not easily trifled with. Neither was he the man to accept a tight situation without making a hot fight for it. It was just these things which gave Hervey the gentle qualms of excitement as he meditated upon the object of his journey. He thought of the large sums of money he had borrowed from this man, and the ease with which they had been obtained. He remembered the kindly ways and gentle manner of this reserved man, and somehow he could not get away from the thought of the velvet glove. But even as he thought of it he laughed. There was no getting away from the facts he possessed, and if it came to anything in the shape of physical resistance, well, he was not unprepared. There was a comfortable feeling about the heavy jolt of the six-chambered lawyer in his pocket. The valley seemed much more lonely than usual. The horrid screeching of the watchful sentries would almost have been welcome to him. The forest was so dark and still. Even the falling raindrops and the deep rolling thunder had no power to give the place any suggestion of life. There was a mournful tone over everything that caused the rider to glance about him furtively and wish for a gleam of prairie sunlight. At length he drew up at the house. There was no one about. A few cattle were calmly reposing in the corrals. There was not even the sharp bark of a dog to announce his arrival. As Hervey drew up he looked to see Iredale come to the door, for he knew the rancher had returned from his wanderings. But the front door remained shut, and although the window of the sitting-room was wide open, there was no sign of any occupant within the room. He dismounted and stood thinking for a moment. Then he raised his voice and called to Chintz. His summons was repeated before the man's ferret face appeared round a corner of the building. The little fellow advanced with no show of alacrity. Iredale had told him nothing about any expected visitor. He was not quite sure what to do. By dint of many questions and replies, which took the form of nods and shakes of the head on the part of Chintz, Hervey learnt that Iredale had gone over to Loon Dyke, and that he would be back to supper. "Then I'll wait for him," he said decidedly. "You can take my horse. I'll go inside." The head man took the horse reluctantly, and Hervey passed into the house. For a long time he stood at the open window watching the storm. How it raged over the valley! The rain came down in one steady, hissing deluge, and the hills echoed and re-echoed with the crashing thunder. The blinding lightning shot athwart the lowering sky till the nerves of the watcher fairly jumped at each successive flash, and he realized what a blessing the deluge of rain was in that world of resinous timber. What might have been the consequences had the storm preceded the rain? Hardened as he was to such things, even Hervey shuddered to think. Wild as was the outlook, the waiting man's thoughts were in keeping with his surroundings, for more relentless they could not well have been. Iredale's money-bags should surely be opened for him that night before he returned home. He would levy a heavy toll for his silence. His great dark eyes, so indicative of the unrestrained nature which was his, burned with deep, cruel fires as he gazed out upon the scene. There was a profoundness, a capacity for hellishness in their expression which scarcely belonged to a sanely balanced mind. It was inconceivable that he could be of the same flesh and blood as his sister, and yet there was no doubt about it. Perhaps some unusually sagacious observer would have been less hard to convince. Hervey was bad, bad all through. Prudence was good. Swayed by emotion, the girl might have displayed some strange, hidden, unsuspected passionate depths, as witness her feelings at her dying lover's bedside. Her rage at the moment when she realized that he had been murdered was indescribable. The hysterical sweep of passion which had moved her at that moment had been capable of tragic impulse, the consequences of which one could hardly have estimated. But her nature was thoroughly good. Under some sudden stress of emotion, which for the moment upset the balance of reason, a faint resemblance to the brother might be obtained. But while Hervey's motives would be bad, hers would have for their primary cause a purpose based upon righteousness. The man needed no incentive to sway his dispositions. He had let go his hold upon the saving rock. Now he floated willingly upon the tide of his evil disposition. He preferred the broad road to hell to the narrow path of righteousness. It may not always have been so. The storm abated with the suddenness of its kind. During Hervey's long wait, Chintz did not leave him entirely alone. Several times, on some trivial pretext, the little man visited the sitting-room, and his object was plainly to keep an eye upon his master's unbidden guest. At last there came a clatter of galloping hoofs splashing through the underlay of the forest, and presently Iredale pulled up at the door. Hervey watched the rancher dismount, and his survey was in the nature of taking the man's moral measure. He looked at the familiar features which he had come to know so well, the easy, confident movements which usually characterized Iredale, the steady glance, the quiet, undisturbed expression of his strong face. The watching man saw nothing unusual in his appearance, nothing to give him any clue. But Hervey was not a keen observer. Only the most apparent change would have been seen by him. The subtler indications of a disturbed mind were beyond his ken. Iredale seemed to be merely the Iredale he knew, and as he watched, his lips parted with a sucking sound, such as the gourmand might make in contemplating a succulent dish. Iredale came in. Hervey met him at the door of the sitting-room, and his greeting was cordial, even effusive. "How are you, George? I knew you were to be back to-day. Jolly glad you've returned. Quite missed you, you know. By Jove, what a storm! Wet?" "A bit. Nothing to speak of. They told me at the farm you were over here." Iredale looked quickly round the room. His survey was not lost upon his visitor. Then he went on. "Chintz looked after you? Had any refreshment? Whisky?" "Chintz looked after me. He looked in every now and then to see what I was doing." Hervey laughed unpleasantly. "Yes, I can do with a gentle forefingers, thanks." Iredale produced a decanter and glasses and a carafe of water. Then he excused himself while he went to change his clothes. While he was gone, Hervey helped himself to a liberal measure of the spirit. He felt that it would be beneficial just then. His host's unconcerned manner was a little disconcerting. The rancher seemed much harder to tackle when he was present. Presently Iredale returned, and seating himself in a deck chair, produced a pipe, and pushed his tobacco jar over to his visitor. He was wondering what Hervey had come over for. He had no wish for his company just then. He had hoped to spend his evening alone. His mind was still in a state of feverish turmoil. However, he decided that he would get rid of the man as quickly as the laws of hospitality would allow. A silence fell whilst the rancher waited to hear the object of the visit. The other refused to smoke, but Iredale lit his pipe and smoked solemnly. His face was, if possible, more serious than usual. His eyes he kept half veiled. Hervey cast about in his mind for the opening of his attack. He seated himself on the edge of the table and looked out of the window. He raised his eyes to the leaden sky, then he withdrew his gaze and looked upon the floor. He swung one leg to and fro as he leant sideways and supported his attitude with a hand resting upon the table. At length, as the silence continued and Iredale presently raised his eyes and stared straight at him, he turned to the decanter and helped himself to another drink. Then he set his glass down with a heavy hand. "Good tack, that," he observed. "By the by, where have all your owls departed to? Are they like the ducks, merely come, pause, and proceed on their migratory way? Or perhaps," with a leer, "they only stand on sentry in the valley when you require them to?" Iredale permitted the suspicion of a smile, but there was no geniality in it. On the contrary, it was the movement of his facial muscles alone. Hervey had touched upon delicate ground. "Did they not welcome you with their wonted acclamation?" he asked, removing his pipe from his lips and gently pressing the ash down into the bowl with his finger tip. The other grinned significantly. He had plunged, and now he felt that things were easier. Besides, the spirit had warmed him. "That's a real good game you play, George, old man. The imitation is excellent. I was deceived entirely by it. It was only the other night that I learned that those fearful screech owls were human. Most ingenious on your part. You are well served." Iredale never moved. He smoked quite calmly. His legs were crossed, and the smile still remained about his mouth. Only his eyes changed their expression, but this was lost upon Hervey, for they were half closed. "I don't think I quite understand. Will you explain?" The rancher spoke very deliberately. His voice was well modulated, but cold. Hervey laughed boisterously to cover a slight nervousness. This attitude of Iredale's was embarrassing. He had anticipated something different. "Is there any need of explanation?" he asked, when his forced hilarity had abruptly terminated. "The only thing which puzzles me is that you've kept it up so long without being discovered." There was a long pause. Then Iredale removed his pipe from his mouth, knocked it out upon the heel of his boot, and returned it to his pocket. Then he rose from his seat and stood squarely before the other. "Don't let us beat about the bush," he said. "I think plain speaking is best, in some cases. Now, what have you to say?" Hervey shrugged his shoulders. His dark eyes avoided the other's gaze. The steely flash in Iredale's grey eyes was hard to confront. "A good deal," he said with raucous intonation. "The smuggling of Chinese, and consequently opium, is a profitable trade. There's room for more than one in it." "Go on." Iredale's tone was icy. "Of course I am not the man to blow a gaff like this. There's too much money in it, especially when worked on extensive lines, and when one is possessed of such an ideal spot as this from which to operate. That was a positive stroke of genius of yours, in selecting the graveyard as a hiding place. I suppose now that place is honeycombed with cellars for the storage of yellow. Must be, from the number of yellow devils I saw come out of the grave the other night. My, but you're slick, Iredale. Slick as paint. I admire you immensely. Who'd have thought of such a thing? I tell you what, you were never intended for anything but defeating the law, George, my boy. We could do a lot together. I suppose you aren't looking for a partner?" Iredale's face wore an almost genial expression as he replied. The rancher's tones were so cordial that Hervey congratulated himself upon the manner in which he had approached the subject. "Well, to tell you the truth, I wasn't," he said. "As a matter of fact, you must have seen me dispatching my last cargo of yellow. Why, were you thinking of starting in the business?" "That is my intention." "Is?" "Yes, is." Hervey's tone was emphatic and his attitude truculent. "Ah, are you prepared to buy this place?" Iredale went on. "I can easily hand you over my connection." "Buy?" Hervey thought this man was dense. "Why, I haven't 2 cents to my name to buy anything with. No, I don't think there will be any buying and selling between us, George Iredale." "Then what do you propose? It may as well come to a definite arrangement." The ranger's tone was peculiar. "We'll run this thing for all it's worth. Hang to it as long as there's a cent to be made." Hervey helped himself to more whisky. His self-satisfaction was immense. He had not thought that Iredale would have been so easy to handle. A very nice, comfortable arrangement for you." Iredale moistened his lips slowly. "You'll sup the juice while I squeeze the orange for you. No, friend Hervey, I'm not dealing." "But you must." "Must?" "Yes, don't be a fool. It means more money to you, and I shall share in the profits." "If I wanted to make more money, I could continue in the business alone. I am not here to make money for you." Iredale stared straight into the face before him. His grey eyes seemed to pierce through and through his companion. Hervey moved from his position. Iredale's attitude was coldly uncompromising. "Then you refuse my offer?" "Most emphatically." Hervey was inclined to show his teeth. However, he checked the impulse and spoke in a conciliating tone. "There is another alternative. Your fortune is very large. I want $50,000. Iredale's face relaxed into a genuine smile. "Your demands are too modest," he said ironically. "Anything else?" The other's eyes looked dangerous. The lurid depths were beginning to glow. "The money I am going to have before I leave here to night." "Ah, blackmail. I thought so." Iredale's contempt was biting. "Call it what you like, Mr. George Iredale. I tell you this, you are in my power, and you will have to buy my silence. You like plain speaking, and now you've got it. Refuse compliance, and I leave here to expose you." "Pooh," said Iredale, leisurely turning to the window. "Do you think I'm a babe? How are you going to prove your charge? Why, you must be the veriest simpleton to think I am unprepared. By the time you can bring the law about me, there will not remain a trace of my work. You can never bring your charge home." "Ah, you think not?" Hervey's words sounded like a snarl. The whisky he had drunk had worked him to a proper pitch. He had not done yet. His next shot was to be a long one, and a bold one, and he was not sure where it would hit. He was not sure it might not rebound, but his was the nature which makes for successive disaster without a second thought. For him there was no middle course. His temperament was volcanic, and his actions were largely governed by the passionate nature which was his. Iredale had not turned from the window, or he would have seen the evil working of that face. His own great broad shoulders were set squarely before Hervey's gaze, and the uncompromising attitude only added fuel to the latter's already superheated feelings. "Perhaps you might find it interesting to know that they are hot upon the trail of the man who shot Leslie Grey." Iredale swung round like a flash. Nor were the storm clouds which but now frowned in the heavens more black than the expression of his face. "You miserable hound!" he cried, his eyes sparkling, and his jaw muscles fairly quivering with the force of his clenched teeth. "What hellish crime would you attempt to fix on me now?" Hervey grinned with all the ferocity of a tiger. "I wish to fix no crime on you. I merely mention a fact. Leslie Grey was the only accuser of his murderer. He stated before he died that the man who inserted the notice in the paper which ran 'Yellow booming, slump in Grey,' was the man who murdered him. I suppose you don't happen to know who was responsible for that enigmatical line? You did not inspire it?" The look that accompanied the man's words was fiendish. The great eyes shone with a savage light. They expressed a hatred which no words could describe. Iredale's hands clenched and unclenched. His fingers seemed as though they were clutching at something which they longed to tear to atoms. And his thoughts centred upon the man before him. Twice that day he had heard this challenge, once uttered in all unconsciousness of its significance, but now with hideous meaning. His powers of self-restraint were great, but he had reached their limit. This man had accused him of a dastardly murder. Suddenly his voice rang out through the room like the bellow of a maddened bull. His great figure quivered with the fury of his passion. Hervey had done his worst. Now he shrank before the storm he had provoked. "Out of my house, you scum!" Iredale roared. "God, but if you stay here an instant longer I'll smash you as I would a louse." The rancher stood panting at the door. His flashing eyes never left the face of the man before him. Hervey moved. He hesitated. The grin had left his face and a look of dread had replaced it. Then he moved on, forgetful of all but his moral and physical fear of the commanding figure of enraged manhood that seemed to tower over him. He even forgot the weapon which lay concealed in his pocket. He slunk on out the door amidst a profound silence, out into the soft twilight of the valley. The door stood open. The window stood open. Iredale looked after him. He watched the tall, drooping figure. Then, as Hervey passed from view, Iredale turned back and flung himself into his chair, and his laugh sounded through the stillness of the room. But there was no mirth in that laugh. It was like the hysterical laugh of a man whose nerves are strained to breaking tension. He knew he had made a terrible mistake. His rage had placed a deadly weapon in his enemy's hands. He had practically admitted his authorship of the notice in the Winnipeg paper. What would be the result? He asked himself. Again that strained laugh sounded through the room. As Hervey rode away from the valley, his fear of George Iredale fell from him as might a cloak. His face wore full expression of the evil in his heart. He, too, laughed, but his laugh was an expression of triumph. "You're less clever than I thought, George Iredale," he muttered. "You would have done better to have bought my silence. Now I can sell my discovery elsewhere. Money I want, and money I mean to have." But he spurred his horse on as an anxious thought came to him. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 14. A Stab in the Dark. Mrs. Malling fumbled her glasses out of her pocket and adjusted them on her nose. She had paused in her work to receive her letters which had just been brought from Lakeville. The girls stood by waiting to learn the news. The summer kitchen was stifling hot. The great cook stove, throwing off a fearful heat, helped to heighten the brilliancy of the farm wife's complexion, and brought beads of perspiration out upon her forehead. Prudence and Alice looked cool beside Mother Hepsy, but then they were never allowed to do any work in the kitchen. Mrs. Malling loved her kitchen better than any part of the house. She had always reigned supreme there, and as long as she could work, such would always be the case. Now she was preparing the midday meal for the threshing gang which was at work in the fields. Great blocked tin canteens stood about upon the floor, waiting to receive the hot food which was to be sent down to the workers. Hepzibah was a woman of generous instincts where the inner man was concerned. The wages she paid were always board wages, but no hired man was ever allowed to work for her and pay for his keep. She invariably insisted that every labourer should be fed from her kitchen, and she took care that his food was the best she could provide. "Alice," the old lady said, as she tore open the first letter, "go and see if Andy is hitching up yet. Tell him that the dinner boxes will be ready in quarter hour. Maybe you'll find him in the bean patch. I sent him to gather a peck o' broad beans. Who's this from?" she went on, turning to the last page of her letter to look at the signature. Winnipeg. The bank. Guess I'll read that later." Alice ran off to find Andy, and Mrs. Malling picked up another envelope. "Prudence, my girl," went on the farm wife, as soon as Alice's back was turned, "just open that other," pointing to a blue envelope. "The postmark reads Ainsley. I take it it's from young Rob Chillingwood. Maybe it's to say as he'll be along directly." Prudence picked the last letter up. "It is hot in here, mother. I wonder you can stand it." Her mother looked up over her spectacles. "Stand it, child? It's a woman's place, is the kitchen. I can't trust no one at the stove but myself. I've done it for over 40 summers, and I don't reckon to give it up now. This is from that police feller. He ain't doing much, I'm thinking. Seems to me he spends most of his time in making up his bills of expenses. Howsome, you look into it. What's Master Rob say?" She put her glasses back into their broad old-fashioned case and turned back to the stove. She could never allow anything to keep her long from her cooking. She lifted a lid and stabbed her cooking fork gently into a great boiler full of potatoes. Then she passed round to the other side and shook up the fire. "Oh, what a shame, mother! Won't Al be disappointed? Rob can't come out here, at least not to stay." Prudence had finished her letter and now looked disappointedly over at her mother. "And how be that?" asked the old lady, standing with a shovel of anthracite coal poised in her hand. "It says that the rush of immigrants to the district keeps him at work from daylight to dark. It's too bad. Poor old Al." Mrs. Malling dumped the coal into the stove with a clatter and replaced the circular iron top. She said nothing, and Prudence went on. "He's coming out this way on business shortly, and will call over here if possible. But he can't stay. Says he's making money now, and is writing to Al and giving her all particulars. I am sorry he can't come." "Well, well, maybe it's for the best," said her mother in a consolatory manner. "Seemingly his coming would only ha' caused bickerings with Hervey, and, good sakes, we get enough of that now. I'm not one for underhand dealings, but I'm thinking it would be for the best not to say anything to your brother about his coming at all. If he asks, just say he can't come to stop. I'd sooner keep Hervey under my eye. If he goes off, as he said, you never know what mischief he'll be getting up to. He just goes into Winnipeg and gets around with them scallywags, and you never know. I have heard tell, though he never lets on, as he's too fond o' poker. Leastways, I do know as he spends more money than is good for him. Sarah and me was talking only the other day. Sarah's pretty cute, and she declares that he's got gaming writ in his lines. Maybe it's so, I'll not dispute. He won't have no excuse for leaving now." And she sighed heavily and took up the vegetables from the stove. Alice returned, and the sound of wheels outside told the farm wife that the buckboard was ready for the men's dinner. The two girls and the old lady portioned out the food into the great canteens, and Andy lifted them on to the buckboard. Then the choremen drove away. By the time the farm dinner was ready, Alice had quite got over her disappointment. Prudence had told her the contents of the letter, and also her mother's wishes on the subject. Alice was naturally too cheerful to think much of the matter. Besides, she was glad that Rob's business was improving. Hervey came up from the fields in Andy's buckboard. He always came home for his dinner, and to-day he brought an atmosphere of unwonted cheerfulness with him. He had spent much thought and consideration upon his relations with George Iredale, and the result of his reflections was displayed in his manner when he returned from the fields. Never in his life had he held such a handful of trumps. His hand needed little playing, and the chances of a cross ruff looked to him remote. After the meal he went out to the barn, where he smoked for a while in pensive solitude. He thought long and earnestly, and was so absorbed that he looked up with a start at the sound of his mother's voice calling to him from the open kitchen window. "Bestir yourself, Hervey, boy. There's work to be done down in the fields, which is your share in the day's doin's." And the man, removing the pipe from his mouth, forgot to grumble back a rough retort, and answered quite cheerfully, "All right, mother. Is Prudence there?" "Where should she be if not?" replied his mother, turning back from the window to tell his sister that she was wanted. Prudence came out. Hervey watched her as she approached. He could not but admit to himself the prettiness of her trim figure, the quiet sedateness of her beautiful, gentle face. Gazing intently, he failed to observe the faint shadow in the expression of her soft brown eyes. There was no sympathy in his nature, and without sympathy it would have been impossible to read the expression. But Prudence was feeling a little sad and a little hurt. Iredale had not fulfilled his promise. 2 days had passed since he had told her that he loved her, and had asked her to be his wife, nor since then had he been over to the farm, nor had she heard a word from him. Fortunately, she told herself, she had said nothing of what had passed between them, not even to her friend Alice. Thus she was spared the sympathy of her friends. She had waited for his coming with a world of eager delight in her heart, and each moment of the day on which he was to have come to see her mother had been one of unalloyed happiness to her. Then, as the evening drew on, she became anxious, and again, as night came and still no sign from him, her anxiety had given place to alarm. That night she slept little, but she kept her trouble to herself. Alice was all eagerness to ask questions of her friend, but Prudence gave her no opportunity. The next morning a note had arrived. Business detained him, but he would be over at the earliest possible moment. And now the third day was well advanced and he still remained away. She did not doubt him, but she felt hurt and a little rebellious at the thought of his allowing himself to be detained by business. Surely his first duty was to her. It was not like him, she told herself, and she felt very unhappy. Hervey greeted her with an assumption of kindness, almost of affection. "Are you busy, Prue? I want to have a little talk with you. I've been working in your interests lately. You may guess in what direction. And I have made a strange discovery. We haven't hit it off very well, I know, but you must forgive me my shortcomings. I have lived too long in the wilds to be a pleasant companion. Can you spare me a few minutes?" The dark eyes of the man were quite gentle in their expression, and in the girl's present state of mind his apparent kindness had a strong effect upon her. She was surprised, but she smiled up into his face with a world of gratitude. In spite of all, her love for her brother was very deeply rooted. The simplicity of her nature and the life she lived made her an easy victim to his villainous wiles. "Why, yes, Hervey, as long as you like." "Good. I'm going down to the threshing. Will you walk some part of the way with me? Mother has just reminded me that my work must not be neglected. Another 2 days and we shall be ready for the fall ploughing." The sun was pouring down with fervid intensity. The yard was very still and quiet. Everything that had leisure was resting drowsily in the trifling shade obtainable. The swine had ceased to make themselves heard and were sleeping upon each other's abdomens. The fowls were scratching with ruffled feathers in the sandy hollows of the parched earth which they had made during the hours of morning energy. The pigeons had departed for the day to the shelter of a distant bluff. Even the few horses remaining within the barn were dozing. The dog Nesh alone seemed restless. He seemed to share with his master the stormy passions of a cruel heart, for with infinite duplicity he was lying low, pretending to be occupied with a great beef shin-bone, while his evil eyes watched intently the movements of a half-dozen weary milch cows, which were vainly endeavouring to reach the shelter of their sheds. But the dog would not have it. With a refinement of torture he would allow them to mooch slowly towards their yard, then, just as they were about to enter, he would fly into a dreadful passion, and limping vigorously at their heels, would chase them out upon the prairie, and then return once more to his bone, only to await his opportunity for repeating the operation. Hervey and Prudence moved away and passed down the trail. Nesh reluctantly left his bone, having satisfied himself in a comprehensive survey that no canine interloper was about who could steal his treasure during his absence, and followed them. He walked beside the girl without any sign of pleasure. He was a dog that seemed to find no joy in his master's or mistress's company. He seemed to have no affection in him, and lived a life of mute protest. Hervey did not speak for a few minutes. It was Prudence who broke the silence. "I suppose it is something to do with Leslie's death that you want to talk to me about. I wondered what your object was when you questioned me so closely upon his dying words. Have you discovered a fresh clue?" Something more than a fresh clue. Hervey had relapsed into his old moroseness. "Ah!" The girl's face lit with an almost painful eagerness. For a moment her own immediate troubles were forgotten. A wild feeling surged up in her heart which set the blood tingling in her veins, and she waited almost breathlessly for her brother's next words. Hervey displayed no haste. Rather, he seemed as though he would gain time. "That message or advertisement in the paper. Did you ever attempt to fathom its meaning? It was something of a puzzle." Prudence gazed up at the dark face beside her. Hervey was looking down upon the dusty trail. His look was one of profound thought. In reality he was calculating certain chances. "I tried, but failed dismally. To me it conveyed nothing beyond the fact that its author shot Leslie." "Just so. But before I tell you what I have discovered you must understand the argument. That line contained a message, a message so significant that once read with understanding, the mystery of Grey's death become one that a child might solve. "Yes, yes, but the reading of it," Prudence exclaimed impatiently. "It is intelligible to me." "And—" It was a different girl to the one we have hitherto seen who awaited the man's next words. The old gentle calmness, the patient, even disposition, had given place to a world of vengeful thought. There was a look in those usually soft brown eyes which bore a strange resemblance to her brother's. A moment had arrived in her life when circumstances aroused that other side of her character, of which perhaps even she had been ignorant. She learned now of her own capacity for hatred and revenge. Some preliminary warnings of these latent passions had been given when Grey had died, but the moment had passed without full realization. Now she felt the ruthless sway of a wave of passionate hatred which seemed to rise from somewhere in her heart and creep over her faculties, locking her in an embrace in which she felt her good motives and love being crushed out of all recognition. There could be no doubt as to the resemblance between these two people in that one touch of nature. Hervey was a long time in answering. He had not only to tell her of his discovery, but there was his personal interests to consider. He wished to reassure himself of his own advantage. "See here, Prue, what are you offering, or rather is mother offering, to that detective chap if he discovers the murderer of Grey? Let us quite understand one another. I don't intend to part with my discovery for nothing. I want money as badly as anybody can want it. For a consideration I'll tell you, and prove to you, who murdered your man. Provided, of course, the consideration is sufficiently large. Otherwise I say nothing." For a moment Prudence looked up from beneath her sunbonnet into her brother's face. The scorn in her look was withering. She had long since learned the selfish nature of this man, but she had not realized the full depths to which he had sunk until now. He would sell his information, and the thought scorched her brain with its dreadful significance. "How much will buy you?" she asked at last, and words failed to express the contempt she conveyed in her tone. Hervey laughed in a hollow fashion. "You don't put it nicely," he said. "Ah, how much will buy me?" he added thoughtfully. "When a man chooses the methods of Judas, it seems to me there need be no picking or choosing of words. What do you want? How much?" His answer came swiftly. He spoke eagerly, and his tone was quite different from that which his companion was used to. It was as if some deep note in his more obscure nature had been struck, and was now making itself heard above the raucous jangling of discord by which his life was torn. His words were almost passionate, and there was a ring of truth in them which was astonishing, coming from such a man. "Look here, Prue, I want to get away from here. I want to get out upon the world again, alone, to make my life what I choose. I can't stand this place, the quiet surroundings, the people with whom I come in contact. It isn't living. It's existence, and a hellish one at that. Look around. Prairie, nothing but prairie. In the winter, snow, endless snow. In the summer, the brown, scorched prairie. The round of unrelieved, monotonous labour. Farming. Can mind of man conceive a life more deadly? No, no, I want to get away from it all. Back to the life in which I was my own master, unfettered by duties and distasteful labours for which I am responsible to others. From the beginning my life has been a failure. But that was not originally my fault. I worked hard, and my ideals were sound and good. Then I met with misfortune. My life was my own to make or mar after that. What I chose to do with it was my own concern. But here I do not live. I want the means to get away, to make a fresh start in different surroundings. Sooner or later I must go, or I shall become a raving maniac. You can help me in this, even as I can help you in the cause in which you are now spending and wasting a lot of money. Get mother to give me $15,000, not only as the price of my information, but also to help me, as your brother, to make another start. I am not wanted here, neither do I want to remain." He ceased speaking. The truth had died out of his tone when he mentioned the money, and his words were the specious wheedling of one who knows the generous kindliness of those with whom he is dealing. But Prudence gave no heed to anything but that which found an answering chord in the passionate emotion which swayed her. Hervey's appeal to get away drew from her some slight proportion of sympathetic understanding, but her main feeling was a desire to learn the truth which he had discovered. "Yes, yes, but the clue, discovery." "First the money. First you must show me that you will do this thing for me." "I can only answer for myself. I can promise nothing in mother's name." "Yes, but for yourself. You have an interest in the farm." "Yes, I will give you all I have, all, if you can prove to me, and in a court of law, who was the man who shot Leslie Grey. I have saved nearly everything I have made out of creamery. It is not as large a sum as you require, but I can raise the rest from mother. You shall have all you ask if you can tell me this thing. But bear this in mind, Hervey. You will have to prove your words. I give you my word of honour that the money will be forthcoming when you have accomplished this thing." Prudence spoke earnestly, but there was caution in what she said. She did not trust her brother, and though she was ready to pay almost anything for the accomplishment of her purpose, she was not going to allow herself to be tricked. Hervey didn't like these stipulations. He had calculated to extort a price for his information only. The proving of his charge was a matter which would entail time and trouble, and something else which he did not care to contemplate. Besides, he wanted to get away. His recollection of his recent interview with Iredale was still with him, and he remembered well the rancher's attitude. It struck him that George Iredale would fight hard to prove his innocence. He wondered uncomfortably if he could establish it. No, he must make a better bargain than the girl offered. "See here, Prue, this is a matter of business. There's no sentiment in it as far as I'm concerned. Your conditions are too hard. You pay me half the money down when I give you the story. You can pay the rest when I have carried out your further conditions. It is only fair. Establishing a case in the law courts is a thing that takes time. And besides, I have known guilty people to get off before now. I can convince you of the truth of my case. A jury is different." Prudence thought for a moment. They were already within earshot of the thresher, and the droning of the machine and the jerky spluttering of the traction engine sounded pleasantly in the sultry atmosphere. The dog hobbled lazily at her heels, nor did he show the least sign of interest in his surroundings. The wagons loaded with bountiful sheaves were drawing up to the thresher from half a dozen directions, whilst those already emptied were departing for fresh supplies. Everywhere was a wondrous peace. Only in those two hearts was an ocean of unrest. "Very well. If you can convince me, it shall be as you say. You shall have the money. The rest shall remain until after the jury's verdict. I am not prepared to give you the money I have saved for any tale you choose to concoct. Now let me have your story. You have shown me too much of your sordid craving to make me a ready believer." "You will believe me before I have finished, Prue," the man retorted with a bitter laugh. "You will find corroboration for what I have to tell you in your own knowledge of certain facts." "So much the better for you. Go on." In spite of her cautious words, Prudence waited with nerves tingling and with rapidly beating heart for her brother's story. She did not know herself. She did not understand the feelings which swayed her. Hervey had an easier task than either of them believed. Of late she had dwelt so long, so intently, upon the matter under discussion, that she was ready to believe almost anything which offered a solution to the ghastly mystery. But she did not know this. Hervey told his story with all the cunning of a man who appreciates the results which attach to the effects of his words. He lost no detail which could further his ends. "Grey, on his deathbed, alluded to the notice in the paper. He did so in answer to your question as to who had shot him?" "Yes." "He was perfectly conscious?" "Yes." Some time before he died you and he had discussed this notice, and he told you he was meditating a coup in which that notice had afforded him his principal clue." The girl nodded, and Hervey went on. "Grey was a customs officer. All his works centred round contraband. No other work came into his sphere of operations. Very well, the clue which that notice afforded had to do with some illicit traffic. The question is, what was the nature of that traffic? Here is the obvious solution. Yellow booming. What traffic is known by such a title as yellow in this country? There is only one: traffic in Chinese. The smuggling of Chinese across the border. And this traffic was booming. Operations were being successfully carried out. Where? The rest is easy. Somewhere in Grey's district. Slump in Grey could only mean, under the circumstances, that Grey's supervision was avoided, that the work was carried out in spite of him. You know, everybody knows that Chinese are smuggled into Canada at many points along the border, and that opium is brought in at the same time. Thus the poll tax and the opium tax are avoided by men who make a living out of this traffic. This profit is worth the risk. There is a fortune in smuggling opium. The authorities are endeavouring to put it down. It is well known that our cities are swarming with Chinese for whom no poll tax has been paid. And yet the legitimate importation of opium does not increase. Rather has it decreased in consequence of the prohibitive tax imposed upon it. Still, these Chinese must have their opium. This then was the coup poor Grey meditated. He had discovered a hotbed of opium smuggling. If he succeeded in rounding the smugglers up, it meant a great deal to his future prospects. Is that all plain?" "Yes, yes, go on." The girl's eyes were gleaming strangely. She followed every word her brother said with an intentness which boded well for the result of his efforts. The careful array of arguments was speciously detailed. Now she waited for what was still to come, without any attempt at concealing her impatience. For the time everything was forgotten while she learned of the murderer of her first love. The peaceful scene about her was set before eyes which no longer gazed with intelligence upon their surroundings. She was back in the farm parlour, listening to Leslie's story of his hopes, his aspirations. Every detail of that evening was brought vividly back to her memory. She remembered, too, that was the night on which Hervey had returned. There was a significance in the thought that was not lost upon her. Hervey had come to a stand, and Prudence placed herself before him. Nesh squatted beside her, and as he sat his head reached up to her waist. "Very well. The question alone remains, who along the border in this part of the country is smuggling Chinese? And having found your man, did he insert the notice in question?" "Yes. And you?" "Chance pointed out the man to me, and I have ascertained the rest." "And who is the murderer of Leslie?" There was an impressive pause. Hervey gazed down into the eager upturned face. The dog beside the girl moved restlessly, and as he moved he made a curious whining noise. His nose was held high in the air, and his greenish eyes looked up towards the spotless sunbonnet. The owner of Lonely Ranch, George Iredale. Hervey turned abruptly away. Nesh had moved a little way back along the trail and stood looking about him. Then out on the still air rang a piercing, hysterical laugh, and Prudence stretched out her arm and clutched at the barbed wire fence post, as though her mirth had overcome her. Hervey looked sharply round upon her. Nesh gave a low growl. The noise seemed to have offended him. Then he limped off down the trail back to the house. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 15. The Maggot at the Core. Hervey's look of surprise quickly changed to one of displeasure. To him his sister's attitude merely suggested incredulity, Nothing more." "Well?" he said at last, as her laugh died out suddenly. Prudence turned upon him with a strange fierceness. "Go on. You must tell me more than that to convince me. George Iredale, smuggler, murderer! You must be mad." Hervey kept himself well in hand. He was playing for a great stake. He would lose nothing through any ill-advised bluster. "I was never more sane in my life," he answered coldly. "I am ready to prove my words." "Prove them." Prudence's face and the tone of her voice were icy. Her mouth was set firmly, the declined corners testifying to the hard setting of her jaws. She looked straight into her brother's face with an intentness which made him lower his eyes. He had no conception of the fires which he had stirred within her. One unconquerable desire swayed her. This man must tell her all he knew. Then she would refute every word, tell him what manner of man he was, and have him driven from the farm. She hated him at that moment as she might hate a rattlesnake. She was filled with a longing to strike him, her own brother, to the earth. Hervey spoke in measured, even tones. "You know the ranch and its surroundings well. You have been there. You have heard the so-called owl cries which greet the visitor upon entering the valley. Those are not owl cries at all, but the work of human sentries, always on the watch, ready to give immediate alarm at the approach of danger. The secret of the ranch lies in the graveyard." Prudence started. "That is where I made my first discovery. A discovery of which I should not have understood the significance but for you and your experiences when picnicking in that region 2 or 3 days before. At the time I speak of I had come upon the cemetery for the first time. I had Neche with me. I paused at the broken fence which surrounded it and surveyed the overgrown graves. While I did so, Neche mooched about among them with canine inquisitiveness. Suddenly he became agitated and showed signs of having hit upon a hot scent. I watched him curiously. He ran up a path and then paused at one of the stone-marked graves. Here he began to tear wildly at the edge of it. I followed him up and saw that he had dug a hole below the stone. I dragged him away and found that beneath the stone the grave was hollow. Then I moved hastily away and, taking the dog to the ruined dead house, put him on the scent again. He dashed in, whining excitedly as he went. It was while I stood watching for his return that I discovered the most significant point. Directly under my feet, somewhere under the ground, I heard a sound of hammering. Then I knew that the graveyard was no longer the resting place of the dead, but the abode of the living. Instantly I remembered all the details of your ghost story, and determined to witness for myself the scenes you had observed. Settle it for once and all in your mind." I was troubled with no superstitious fears upon the matter. I guessed the truth. Hervey broke off, but resumed quickly. "That evening I returned to the graveyard surreptitiously, and took up a position in the black shelter of the surrounding woods. I saw all you saw, but the robed figures were not the ghosts which you thought them to be. They were Chinese, carrying their boxes and bundles of personal luggage, and, I have no doubt, a cargo of opium. Then I understood that the graveyard was honeycombed with cellars, and that this place formed the central depot of Iredale's traffic and his distributing station. I can understand how these yellow devils are distributed by means of loaded hay racks and such things. The point I have not fathomed is the means by which the goods are brought into the country. I suggest the only means I can think of as being almost without risk, and that is the lake." Hervey paused to watch the effect of his story. Prudence gave no sign. She no longer looked at her companion, but away across the harvested fields in the direction of Iredale's ranch. As he waited for her comment, her lips moved. "Go on," was all she said, and the man proceeded. It was an unconscious expression which, in the first flush of discovery, I made use of, which ultimately gave me a clue to the rest. As realization of Iredale's doings came to me, I thought of the notorious traffic in yellow. That night I pondered long over the whole thing. I had learned to like Iredale better than any man I have ever known. He had always seemed such an honest, straightforward man, and all of you folks were so fond of him. It was a painful awakening, but there was worse to come, for, as I lay awake thinking, there flashed through my brain the recollection of what you had told me of Grey's death and his reference to the notice in the paper. Instantly the interpretation of that line came to me. It related to the yellow traffic, and I shuddered as I reviewed the possibilities which my discovery opened up. I couldn't rest. A feverish desire to know the worst assailed me. I questioned you, as you may remember, and with every reply you gave me my fears received confirmation. In the end I could no longer keep silence, and my anger drove me to a course which I have since almost regretted, for it has destroyed the last vestige of the regard I entertained for the man you have all so liked and respected. I went over to the ranch and challenged George Iredale. On the night of the storm, the night he visited me. Go on." Prudence's face was ghastly in its pallor. She gave no other sign of emotion. "Yes, on the night of the storm. I taxed him with smuggling. He admitted it. I taxed him with the authorship of that notice." "Well?" The girl leant forward in her eagerness. "He did not contradict it. His attitude was a tacit admission. That is my evidence." Hervey ceased speaking, and a long pause followed. The man waited. He did not wish to hurry her. He was not blind to the fact that she regarded Iredale with something more than mere friendly feeling, and with fiendish cunning he had played upon the knowledge by his allusions to his own regard for the man and the trust which they had placed in him. This woman's love for Iredale he knew would help him, for gradually, as the damning evidence he had produced filtered through her armour of loyal affection, her hatred for the man would be doubled and trebled. In this Hervey displayed a knowledge of human nature which one would scarcely have credited him with. At last Prudence turned. The pallor of her face was unchanged. Only the look in her eyes had altered. The horror which had shone there had become a world of piteous appeal. All her soul shone forth in those sweet brown eyes. Surely it must have needed a heart of stone to resist her. Her body was leaning forward. Her two brown hands were held out towards him. "I don't believe it. I can't believe it. George is no murderer." Hervey's great eyes lowered before that heartful look. His face was a study in hopelessness. From his expression of deep sorrow, Iredale might have been his own brother who was accused of murder. "I'm afraid there's no hope of what you say, Prue." Leslie was conscious. He knew what he was saying. Iredale had every reason for shooting him. The circumstantial evidence is damning, and what sceptical jury would be convinced? "Oh God! Oh God! And he has asked me to be his wife." Prudence covered her face with her hands, and her body heaved with great passionate sobs. Hervey started at the words. His face lit up with a wicked joy. This was better than he had expected. George should pay dearly for his refusal to buy his silence. "You say he dared to propose to you, with that foul crime upon his soul? He is a worse villain than I had believed. By heavens, he shall swing for his crime. I had hoped that my news had come in time to save you this cruel wrong. The scum, the foul, black-hearted scum!" Hervey's rage was melodramatic, but the girl, even in the depths of her misery and distraught feelings, was impressed. Her heart cried out for her lover, and proclaimed his innocence in terms which would not be silenced. His image rose before her mind's eye, and she looked upon that kindly, strong face, the vigorous bearing of that manly figure, and the story she had just listened to became dwarfed as her faith in him rose superior to the evidence of her senses. It could not be. Her quivering lips struggled to frame the words she longed to utter, but no sound came. Hervey's words, his attitude, his appearance of deep, honest sorrow for his sister paralyzed her faculties, and hope died down in her heart. The man moved forward to her side and touched her gently on the shoulders. "Come, Prue, we had best go back to the house. I can do no work to-day. You, too, need quiet, for reflection. The heartless villain!" And he harped upon the information his sister had provided him with. Prudence allowed herself to be led. She did not care whither she went or what happened. She was incapable of reasoning. She was stunned by the cruel blow that had fallen. Later she would recover herself, for all such blows are but passing. In waking moments mind and reason cannot long remain inert and sanity obtain. For the present she was a mere automaton. Hervey grew uncomfortable at the girl's prolonged silence. He cared nothing for her feelings. He cared nothing for the heart he had broken. He cared only for the money he had not yet secured. He realized only too well that, whatever protest his sister might offer, he had convinced her of Iredale's guilt. It was only a question of time before she admitted it openly. But some feeling of doubt prompted him to secure his wage without delay. Thus his greed rushed him on to a false trail. Halfway to the house he broke the silence. "Well, Prue, you cannot refute my evidence. Iredale is the man you have all been seeking. I have served you well. You yourself have escaped a course which would have brought you lifelong regret. Think of it. What would it have meant to you had you married the man? Terrible, terrible." The girl looked up. There was a wild, hunted look in her eyes. Her brother's words had in some way driven her at bay. He had struck a chord which had set her every nerve on edge, and in doing so had upset all her best laid schemes. A flood of passionate protest surged to her lips and flowed forth in a seething torrent. She remembered what his story had been told for. She had forgotten for the moment, so well had he acted his part, and had thought only that what he had said was the outcome of his regard for her. Now she turned upon him like a tigress. "Judas!" she cried, a flush of rage sweeping up into her face as the words hissed from between her teeth. "You have come to sell this man. Your thoughts have nothing to do with the meting out of human justice. You want a price for your filthy work. I loathe you. What curse is on our family that you should have been born into it? You shall have your money, do you hear? You shall have it, and with it goes my curse. But not yet. My conditions are not fulfilled. I do not believe you. Your story has not convinced me. I can see no reason in it. Ha ha!" And she laughed hysterically. "You cannot make me believe it because I will not. You shall have your money. I will not go back on my word. But you must fulfill the conditions. You must convince me of the reason in your story. You will earn your pay as you have never earned anything in your life. Shall I tell you how you will earn it? You will prove your story before judge and jury. When you have convinced them you will have convinced me. Then I will pay you. My God, what taint has brought such blood into the veins of our flesh? If Iredale is the murderer, he shall pay the extreme penalty, and you, whether you like it or not, shall be instrumental in that punishment. You shall be his accuser. You shall see him to the scaffold. And after it is all over, after you have received the sum of your blood money, I will tell the world of your doings, that you, my brother, demanded a price for your work. They, the world, shall know you, shall loathe you, as I loathe you. You shall be an outcast wherever you go, stamped with the brand of Judas, the most despised of all men. Better for you if you stood in George Iredale's place on the scaffold than face the world so branded. Oh, you wretched man, you have destroyed my life, my all. Go and bring the police. Go to those whose duty it is to listen to such stories as yours. Now I will drive you to it. You shall go whether you like it or not. Refuse, and I will lay the information and force you to become a witness. You thought you were dealing with a soft, silly woman. You thought to cajole the price out of me, and then, having obtained what you desired, to leave me to do the work. Fool! You will face George Iredale, the accuser and the accused. You shall earn your money. I know the ways of such men as you. Do you know what you are doing? Do you know the name that such work as yours goes by? It is blackmail." The girl paused for breath. Then she went on with a bitterness that was almost worse than the contempt in all she had said before. "But rest content. Every penny you have asked for shall be yours when Iredale's crimes are expiated. Nor shall I give to the world the story of my brother's perfidy until such time as you have gone out of our world for ever. Go, go from me now. I will not walk beside you." Hervey's face was a study in villainous expression as he listened to his sister's hysterical denunciation. He knew the reason of her tirade. He knew that she loved Iredale. He had convinced her of this lover's crimes, he knew this, and now, womanlike, she turned upon him, for his hand, his words had destroyed her happiness. But her words smote hard. The lowest natures care not what others think of them, but those others' spoken thoughts have a different effect. So it was with Hervey. It mattered nothing to him what the girl thought of him, what the world thought of him, but words, abuse, had still power to move him. She struck the right note when she said the money down was what he wanted. Now he saw that he had overreached himself, and he cursed himself for having trusted to a woman's promise. There was but one thing left for him to do. He controlled himself well when he replied. "Very well, sister," he said. "In spite of what you say, you are going back on your word. You should have thought to fling dirt before you entered into a compact with me. However, I care nothing for all your threats. As you have said, I want money. Nothing else matters to me. So I will go to Winnipeg and see this thing through." "You certainly will have to do so. Andy shall drive you into town to night. And I could find it in my heart to wish that I might never see your face again." "Very well," Hervey laughed harshly. "As you wish. I accept your commands. See you as readily fulfil your part of the contract when the time comes. You do not hoodwink me again with impunity." And so brother and sister parted. The girl walked on to the house, her feet dragging wearily over the dusty trail. Hervey paused irresolutely. His burning eyes, filled with a look of bitter hatred, gazed after the slight figure of his sister, whose life he had so wantonly helped to wreck. Then he laughed cruelly, and turned abruptly back on his tracks and returned once more to the harvesters. Prudence gained the house and went straight to her room. She wanted to be alone. She wanted to straighten out the chaos of her thoughts. She heard the cheery voices of her mother and Alice talking in the kitchen. She heard the clatter of plates and dishes, and she knew that these two were washing up. But beyond that she noticed nothing. She did not even see the plump figure of Sarah Gurridge approaching the house from the direction of Leonville. Once in her own little room she flung herself into an armchair and sat staring straight in front of her. Her paramount feeling was one of awful horror. The mystery was solved, and George Iredale was the murderer. The metal alarm clock ticked away upon the wooden top of her bureau, and the sound pervaded the room with its steady throb. Her feelings, her thoughts, seemed to pulsate in concert with its rhythm. The words which expressed her dominant emotions hammered themselves into her brain with the steady precision of the ticking. George Iredale, the murderer of Leslie Grey. The moments passed, but time brought the girl no relief. All thought of the man who had told her of this thing had passed from her. Only the fact remained. Slowly, as she sat with nerves tingling and whirling brain, a flush of blood mounted to her head. Her brain became hot, and she seemed to be looking out on a red world. The ticking of the clock grew fainter and more distant. The room seemed to diminish in size, while the objects about her drew nearer and nearer. A sense of compression was hers, although she seemed to be gazing out over some great distance, with everything around her in due perspective. Mechanically she rose and opened the window. Then she returned to her chair with something of the action of an automaton. And as she sat, the blood seemed to recede from her brain, and an icy dew broke out upon her forehead. She was numbed with a sort of paralysis now, and the measured beat of the clock no longer pounded out the words of her thought. Only her heart beat painfully, and she was conscious of a horrible void. Something was wrong with her, but she was incapable of realizing what it was. She moved, the chair creaked under her, and again thought flowed through her brain. It came with a rush. The deadly numbness had gone as quickly as it had come, and once more her faculties worked feverishly. Now she realized pain, horror, despair, hopelessness in a sudden, overwhelming flood. She shrank back deeper into the chair as though to avoid physical blows which were being rained upon her by some unseen hand. Presently she started up with a faint cry. She walked across the room and back again. She paused at the bureau, muttering, "It can't be, it can't be," she said to herself in an agony of terror. "George is too good, too honest. Ah!" Her love cried out for the man, but reason checked her, while her heart tried to rush her into extravagant hopefulness. Iredale had admitted the smuggling. She had seen with her own eyes the doings at the graveyard, and therein lay the key to everything. Leslie had said so with his dying breath. But as this thought came to her it was chased away by her love in a fresh burst of fervour. She could not believe it. There must be some awful, some horrible mistake. Slowly her mind steadied itself. The long years of calmness which she had spent amidst the profound peace of the prairie helped her. She gripped herself lest the dreadful thought of what she had heard should drive her to madness. She went over what she had been told with a keen examination. She listened to her own arguments for and against the man she loved. She went back to the time when Leslie had told her of his coup. She remembered everything so well. She paused as she recollected her dead lover's anger at George's coming to the party, and for a moment her heart almost stood still. She asked herself, had she misinterpreted this meaning? Had there been something underlying his expressed displeasure at George's coming which related to what he knew of his, George Iredale's, doings at the ranch? Every word he had said came back to her. She remembered that he had finished up his protest with a broken sentence. And besides, there was a significance in those words now which she could not help dwelling upon. Then she put the thought from her as her faith in her lover reasserted itself. But the effort was a feeble one. Her love was being overwhelmed by the damning evidence. She moved restlessly from the bureau to the window. The curtained aperture looked out upon the far-reaching cornfields, which were now only a mass of brown stubble. In the distance, beyond the dike, she could see the white steam of the traction engine and the figures of many men working. The carts and racks were moving in the picture, but for all else the view was one of peaceful, unbroken calm. Her mind passed on to the time when the party had broken up. She remembered how, in searching for Iredale, she had found the two men quarrelling, or something in that nature. Again Leslie had been on the verge of telling her something, but the moment had gone by and he had kept his silence. She tried to deny the significance of these findings, but reason checked her, and her heart sank to zero, and she no longer tried to defend her lover. Then came the recollection of that picnic, the screech owls, the boats laden with their human freight moving suspiciously over the waters of the great lake. She thought of the graveyard and the ghostly procession, and all the time her look was hardening and the protests of her heart slowly died out. If she had doubted Hervey's words, all these things of which she now thought were facts evident to her own senses. The hard light in her eyes changed to the bright flash of anger. This man had come to her with his love, she reminded herself, and she had yielded to him all that she had power to bestow. The brown eyes grew darker, until their glowing depths partially resembled those of her brother. As the anger in her heart rose her pain increased, and she recoiled in horror at the thought that this man had dared to offer his love, while his hands were stained with black crime. At best he was a law-breaker, at the worst he was... She paced her room with agitated steps. The blood rose to her head again, and she felt dizzy and dazed. What could she do? What must she do? She longed for someone to whom she could tell all that was in her heart, but she could not speak of it. She dared not. She felt that she must be going mad. Through all her agony of mind she knew that she loved this man who was a murderer. She told herself that she hated him, and she knew that she lied to deceive herself. No, no, he was not guilty. He had not been proved guilty, and no man is guilty until he is proved so. Thoughts crowded thick and fast on her sorely taxed brain, and again her hands went up to her head with the action of one who is mentally distracted. But in spite of the conflict that raged within her, the angry light in her eyes grew, and a look which was out of all keeping with the sweet face was slowly settling itself upon her features. Again she cried in her heart, "What shall I do?" Suddenly a light broke through her darkness and revealed to her a definite course. This man must not be judged, at least by her, without a hearing. Why should she not go to him? Why not challenge him with the story? If he were the murderer, perhaps he would strike her to earth and add her to the list of his victims. She laughed bitterly. It would be good to die by his hand, she thought. Under any circumstances life was not worth living. The thought fascinated her. Yes, she would do it. Then her spirit of justice rose and rebelled. No, he would then go unpunished. Leslie's death would remain unavenged. The murderer would have triumphed. She thought long. She moved wildly about the room. And as the hours passed, a demon seemed to come to her and take hold of her. It was the demon which looked out of her brother's eyes, and which now looked out of hers. He whispered to her, and her willing ears listened to all he said. Her heart, torn by conflicting passions, drank in the cool promptings. Why not kill him? Why not kill him? Suggested the demon. If he is guilty, kill him, and your life will not have been lived in vain. If he be a murderer, it were but justice. You will have fulfilled your promise of vengeance. After that you could turn your hand against yourself. And her heart echoed the question, why not? For nearly an hour she continued to pace her room. Yes, yes, hers was the right, she told herself. If he were the murderer, she did not care to live. They should die together. They should journey beyond together. She thought over all the details, and all the time the demon looked out of her eyes and jogged her with fresh arguments when her heart failed. She knew where her brother kept his pistols. She would wait until he had set out for Winnipeg. Then, on the morrow, she would ride over to Lonely Ranch. She nursed her anger. She encouraged it at every turn. And she longed for the morrow. But outwardly she grew calm. Only her eyes betrayed her, and they were not the eyes of perfect sanity. They glowed with a lurid fire, the fire which shone in the fierce, dark eyes of her brother. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 16. An Echo from the Alaskan Mountains. Alice searched all over the farm for her friend. The last place in which she thought of looking was the little bedroom the two girls shared. Here at length she arrived, and a shock awaited her. Prudence was sitting beside the window. She was gazing out at the bare, harvested fields, nor did she turn at her friend's approach. It was not until Alice spoke that she looked around. "Here you are, Prue. Why, whatever's the matter?" she exclaimed, as she noted the grey pallor of the face before her, the drawn lines about the mouth, the fiercely burning eyes. "You poor soul, you are ill, and you never told me a word about it. I've been looking everywhere for you. It's tea time. What is it, dear?" "Do I look ill?" Prudence asked wearily. She passed her hand across her forehead. She was almost dazed. Then she went on as she turned again to the window. "I'm all right. My head is aching, that's all. I don't think I want any tea." The next moment she was all alertness. "Has Hervey returned from the fields?" "Hervey? Yes, why? He's returned and gone away again, gone into Winnipeg. He nearly frightened poor Mother Hepsy out of her wits. Came in all of a sudden and declared he must hurry off to Winnipeg at once, and he wanted Andy to drive him. You know his way. He wouldn't give any explanation. He was like a bear to his mother. My fingers were just itching to slap his face. But come along, dear, you must have some tea. It'll do your head good." While she was speaking, Alice's eyes never left her friend's face. There was something about Prudence's expression she didn't like. Her mind at once reverted to thoughts of fever and sunstroke and such things, but she said nothing that might cause alarm. She merely persisted when the other shook her head. Eventually her persuasions prevailed. "Mother Hepsy's fretting away downstairs, and Sarah is backing her up. The long-suffering Mary has been catching it in consequence. So come along and be your most cheerful self, Prue. The poor old dears must be humoured." And Alice, with gentle insistence, led her companion down to the parlour. "And where, miss, have you been all this precious time?" asked Mrs. Malling when the two girls reached the parlour. "Sleeping, I'll be bound, to judge by them spectacles around your eyes. There's no git-up about young folks nowadays," she went on, turning to Sarah. "6 hours sleep for healthy-minded women, I says, not an hour more nor an hour less. Sister Emma was allus one of them for her siesta." Then she turned back to Prudence. "Maybe she learned you, my girl." "I haven't been sleeping, mother," Prudence protested, taking her place at the table. "I don't feel very well." "Oh, you don't say so!" exclaimed the old lady, all anxiety at once. "And why didn't you tell me before? Now maybe you got a touch of the sun?" "Have you been feeling faint and giddy?" asked Sarah, fixing her quiet eyes upon the girl's face. "No, I don't think so. I've got a headache, nothing more." "Ah, cold bath and lemon soda," observed her mother practically. "Tea and be left alone," suggested Sarah. "Nature designs all human ills, but in the making suggests the cure which best is for the taking." Her steady old eyes seemed able to penetrate mere outward signs. "Quite right, Aunt Sarah," said Alice decidedly. "Leave the nostrums and quackeries alone. Prue will be all right after a nice cup of tea. Now, Mother Hepsy, one of your best for the invalid, and please, I'll have some more ham." "That you shall, you flighty harum-scarum. And to think of the likes of you dictating to me about nostrums and physickings," replied the farm wife with a comfortable laugh. "I'll soon be having Mary teaching me to toss a buckwheat slapjack. Now see and cut from the sides of that ham where the curin's primest. I do allow as the hams didn't cure just so last winter. Folks at my board must have of the best." "I never knew any one to get anything else here," laughed Alice. Then she turned her head sharply and sat listening. Mrs. Malling looked over towards the window. Prudence silently sipped her tea, keeping her eyes lowered as much as possible. She knew that, in spite of their talk, these kindly people were worried about her, and she tried hard to relieve their anxiety. "Some one for us," said Alice, as the sound of horses' hoofs came in through the open window. "Some one from Lakeville, I expect," said Mrs. Malling, making a guess. "That's George Iredale's horse," said Sarah, who had detected the sound of a pacer's gait. Prudence looked up in a startled, frightened way. Sarah was looking directly at her. She made no further comment aloud, but contented herself with a quiet mental note. "Something wrong," she thought, "and it's to do with him. Poor child, poor child. Maybe she's fretting herself because—" Her reflections were abruptly broken off as the sound of a man's voice hailing at the front door penetrated to the parlour. "Anyone in?" cried the voice, and instantly Alice sprang to her feet. "It's Rob!" she exclaimed. There was a clatter as her chair fell back behind her. She nearly fell over it, reached the door, and the next moment those in the parlour heard the sound of joyous exclamations proceeding from the hall. Prudence's expression was a world of relief. Her mother was overjoyed. "This is really good. Bring 'em in, Miss Thoughtless. Don't keep 'em there a philandering when there's good fare in the parlour." "Love feeds on kisses, we read in ancient lay, meaning the love of yore, not of to-day," murmured Sarah with a pensive smile, while she turned expectantly to greet the visitor. Radiant, her face shining with conscious happiness, Alice led her fiancé into the room, and Rob Chillingwood found himself sitting before the farm wife's generous board almost before he was aware of it. While he was being served he had to face a running fire of questions from at least 3 of the ladies present. Rob was a cheerful soul, and ever ready with a pleasant laugh. This snatched holiday from a stress of underpaid work was like a bunk to a schoolboy. It was more delightful to him by reason of the knowledge that he would have to pay up for it afterwards with extra exertions and overtime work. "You didn't tell us when you were coming," said Alice. "Didn't know myself. Thought I'd ride over from Iredale's place on spec." "And you've come from there now?" asked Mrs. Malling. Prudence looked up eagerly. "Yes, I've just bought all his stock for a Scotch client of mine." "Scotch?" Sarah turned away with a motion of disgust. "What, has George sold all his beasties at last?" exclaimed the farm wife. "Why, yes, didn't you know? He's giving up his ranch." Rob looked round the table in surprise. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Malling broke in. "He has spoken of it, hinted, but we wasn't expecting it so soon. He's made his pile." "Yes, he must have done so," said Rob readily. "The price he parted with his cattle to me for was ridiculous. I shall make a large profit out of my client. It'll all help towards furnishing, Al," he went on, turning to his fiancée. "I'm so glad you are doing well now, Rob," the girl replied with a happy smile. "Yes." The man turned to Mrs. Malling. "We're going to get married this fall. I hope Alice has been learning something of housekeeping," with a laugh. "Why, yes, Alice knows a deal more than she reckons to let on, I guess," said the farm wife with a fat chuckle. Prudence now spoke for the first time since Rob's arrival. She looked up suddenly, and though she tried hard to speak conversationally, there was a slightly eager ring in her voice. "When is George Iredale going to leave the ranch?" Rob turned to her at once. "Can't say. Not yet, I should think. He seems to have made no preparations. Besides, I've got to see him again in a day or two." "Then you will stay out here?" asked Alice eagerly. "Well, no." Rob shook his head with a comical expression of chagrin. "Can't be done, I'm afraid. But I'll come over here when I'm in the neighbourhood, if possible." Then to Mrs. Malling, "May I?" "Why, certainly," said the farm wife with characteristic heartiness. "If you come to this district without so much as a look in here, well, you can just pass right along for the future." When the meal was over the old lady rose from the table. "Alice," said she, "you stay right here. Sarah and I'll clear away. Prudence, my girl, just lie down and get your rest. Maybe you'll feel better later on. Come along, Sarah. The young folks can get on comfortably without us for once." Prudence made no attempt to do as her mother suggested. She moved about the room, helping with the work. Then the two old ladies adjourned to the kitchen. Rob and Alice moved over to the well-worn sofa at the far end of the room, and Prudence took up her position at the open window. She seemed to have no thought of leaving the lovers together. In fact, it seemed as though she had forgotten their existence altogether. She stood staring out over the little front garden with hard, unmeaning eyes. From her expression it is doubtful if she saw what her eyes looked upon. Her thoughts were of other matters that concerned only herself and another. The low tones of the lovers sounded monotonously through the room. They, too, were now wrapped in their own concerns, and had forgotten the presence of the girl at the window. They had so much to say, and so little time in which to say it, for Rob had to make Ainsley that night. The cool August evening was drawing on. The threshing gang was returning from the fields, and the purple haze of sundown was rising above the eastern horizon. Prudence did not move. Her hands were clasped before her. Her pale face might have been of carved stone. There was only the faintest sign of life about her, and that was the steady rise and fall of her bosom. A cool breeze rustled in through the open window and set the curtains moving. Then all became still again. Two birds squabbled viciously amongst the branches of a blue gum in the little patch of a garden, but Prudence's gaze was still directed towards the horizon. She saw nothing. She felt nothing but the pain which her own thoughts brought her. Suddenly the sound of something moving outside became audible. There was the noisy yawn of some large animal rising from its rest. Then came the slow, heavy patter of the creature's feet. Nesh approached the window. His fierce-looking head stood well above the sill. His greenish eyes looked up solemnly at the still figure framed in the opening. His ears twitched attentively. There was no friendly motion of his straight, lank tail.
but his appearance was undoubtedly expressive of some sort of well-meaning canine regard. Whether the dog understood and sympathized with the girl at the window, it would have taken something more than a keen observer to have said. But in his strangely unyielding fashion he was certainly struggling to convey something to this girl from whom he was accustomed to receive nothing but kindness. For some moments he stood thus, quite still. His unkempt body rose and fell under his wiry coat. He was a vast beast, and the wolf grey and black of his colouring was horribly suggestive of his ancestry. Presently he lifted one great paw to the window. Balancing his weight upon his only serviceable hind leg, he lifted himself and stood with both front feet upon the sill, and pushed his nose against the girl's dress. She awoke from her reverie at the touch, and her hands unclasped, and she slowly caressed the bristly head. The animal seemed to appreciate the attention, for, with his powerful paws, he drew himself further into the room. The girl offered no objection, she paid no heed to what he was doing. Her hand merely rested on his head, and she thought no more about him. Finding himself unrebuffed, Neche made further efforts. Then suddenly he became aware of the other occupants of the room. Quick as a flash his nose was directed towards the old sofa on which they were seated, and his eyes, like two balls of phosphorescent light, gleamed in their direction. He became motionless at once. It seemed as though he were uncertain of something. He was inclined to resent the presence of these two, but the caress of the soft, warm hand checked any hostile demonstration beyond a whine, half plaintive, half of anger. The disturbing sound drew Alice's attention, and she looked over to where Prudence was standing. It was then she encountered the unblinking stare of the hound's wicked eyes. The sight thrilled her for a moment, nor could she repress a slight shudder. She nudged her companion and drew his attention without speaking. Rob followed the direction of her gaze, and a silence followed whilst he surveyed the strange apparition. He could only see the dog's head. The rest of the creature was hidden behind the window curtain, and its enormous size suggested the great body and powerful limbs which remained concealed. To Rob there was a suggestion of hell about the cruel lustre of the relentless eyes. At last he broke into a little nervous laugh. "By Jove," he said, "I thought for a moment I'd got him. Gee whiz, the brute looks like the devil himself. What is it? Whose?" Without replying, Alice called to her friend. "Let Neche come in, Prue," she said. "That is," dubiously, "if you think it's safe." Then she turned to Rob. "He's so savage that I'm afraid of him. Still, with Prue here, I think he'll be all right. He's devoted to her." At the sound of the girl's voice, Prudence turned back from the window like one awakening from a dream. Her eyes still had a far-away look in them, and though she had heard the voice, it seemed doubtful as to whether she had taken the meaning of the words. For a moment her eyes rested on Alice's face, then they drooped to the dog at her side, but Alice was forced to repeat her question before the other moved. Then, in silence, she stepped back and summoned the dog to her with an encouraging chirrup. Neche needed no second bidding. There was a scramble and a scraping of sharp claws upon the woodwork. Then the animal stood in the room, and his attitude, as he eyed the two seated upon the sofa, said as plainly as possible, "Well, which one of you is to be first?" Rob felt uneasy. Alice was decidedly alarmed at the dog's truculent appearance. But the tension was relieved a moment later by the brute's own strange behaviour. Suddenly, without the slightest warning, Neche plumped down upon his hindquarters. His pricked ears drooped, and his two forepaws began to beat a sort of tattoo upon the floor. Then followed a broken whine, tremulous and blandishing, and the great head moved from side to side with that curious movement which only dogs use to express their gladness. Then the strange three-legged beast went further. Down he threw himself full length upon the floor and grovelled effusively, whining and scraping the boards in a perfect fervour of abject delight. Rob looked hard at the dog. Then he laughed and turned to Alice. "What is the creature's name? I didn't catch it." "Neche," she replied. Rob held out his hand encouragingly and called the dog by name. The animal continued to squirm, but did not offer to come nearer. Every now and then its head was turned back, and the green eyes looked up into Prudence's face. At last Rob ceased his efforts. His blandishments were ineffectual, beyond increasing the dog's effusive display. "A husky," he said, looking across at Prudence. "A bad dog to have about the house. He reminds me of the animals we had up north in our dog train. They're devils to handle, and as fierce as wild cats. We had one just like him, unusually big brute. He was our Wheeler, the most vicious dog of the lot. The resemblance is striking. By Jove!" he went on reminiscently. "He was a sulky, cantankerous cuss. His name was Sitting Bull, after the renowned Sioux Indian chief. We had to be very careful of the other dogs on account of his scrapping propensities. He killed one poor beast. I think we nicknamed him rather appropriately. He was affectionately dubbed Bully." As Rob pronounced the name he held out his hand again and flicked his fingers. The dog rose from his grovelling posture and came eagerly forward, wagging his lank tail. He rubbed his nose against the man's hand and slowly licked the sun-tanned skin. Rob's brow drew together in a pucker of deep perplexity. He looked the animal over long and earnestly, and slowly there crept into his eyes an expression of wondering astonishment. He was interrupted in his inspection by the girl at his side. "Why, he's treating you like an old friend, Rob." The man sat gazing down upon the wiry coat of the beast. "Yes," he said shortly. Then he looked over at Prudence. "Yours?" he went on. The girl shook her head. "No, he belongs to Hervey." "I wonder where he got him from," in a meditative tone. "Somewhere out in the wilds of the Yukon," put in Alice. "Ah, the Yukon," and Rob's face was serious as he turned towards the window and looked out at the creeping shadows of evening. There was a pause. Prudence was thinking of anything but the subject of Rob's inquiries. Alice was curious, but she forbore to question. She had heard her lover's account of his misadventures in the Alaskan hills, but she saw no connection between the Hound and that disastrous affair. But the man's thoughts were hard at work. Presently he rose to depart. He bade Prudence good-bye and moved towards the door. The dog remained where he had been standing and looked after him. At the door Rob hesitated. Then he turned and looked back. "Poor old Bully," he said. With a bound the dog was at his side. Then the man turned away and, accompanied by Alice, left the room. In the passage he paused, and Alice saw an expression on his face she had never seen before. He was nervous and excited, and his eyes shone in the half-light. "Al," he said slowly, "I know that dog. And his name is Bully. Don't say anything to anybody. Hervey may be able to tell me something of those who robbed us up in the hills. But on no account must you say anything to him. Leave it to me. I shall come here again soon. Good-bye, little woman." That evening, as Rob Chillingwood rode back to Ainsley, he thought of many things, but chiefly he reviewed the details of that last disastrous journey when he and Grey had traversed the snowfields of Alaska together. Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 17. The Last of Lonely Ranch. There are moments, which come in all lives, when calm reflection is powerless to influence the individual acts, when calmness, even in the most phlegmatic natures, is impossible, when a tide of impulse sweeps us on, giving us not even so much as a breathless, momentary pause in which to consider the result of our headlong career. We blunder up against every jagged obstacle, lacerated and bleeding, jolting cruelly from point to point, whither our passions irresistibly drive us. It is a blind, reckless journey, from which there is no escape when the tide sets in. We see our goal ahead, and we fondly believe that because it is ahead we must come to it. We do not consider the awful road we travel, nor the gradual exhaustion which is overtaking us. We do not realize that we must fall by the wayside for lack of strength, nor even, if our strength be sufficient to carry us on to the end, do we ask ourselves,
Shall we be able to draw aside out of the raging torrent when our goal is reached? Or shall we be swept on to the yawning beyond, where for evermore we must continue to struggle hopelessly to return? Once give passion unchecked sway, and who can say what the end will be? It was at such a moment in her life at which Prudence had arrived. Her mind was set upon an object which absorbed all her faculties, all her brain, all her feelings. Had she been able to pause even for one moment, reason must have asserted itself, and she would have understood the folly of what she was doing. But that moment was denied her. All the latent passions of a strong nature had been let loose, and she was swept on by their irresistible tide. She believed that she was the appointed avenger of the man she had once loved, and that this duty unfulfilled would be a crime, the stain of which nothing could wipe out. Iredale must be confronted, challenged, and so she came to Lonely Ranch on her self-imposed errand of justice. The man she sought was not in the house when she came. The valley seemed to be devoid of life as she rode up, but the solitude was almost instantly broken by the appearance of Chintz from the region of the barn. She dispatched him in search of his master, and passed into the bachelor's sitting-room to await his coming. She was restless, and her nerves were strung to a great tension. Her eyes still shone with that peculiar light which ever seemed to look out of her brother's. There was no yielding in the set of her mouth. Her resolve disfigured the sweetness which usually characterized her beautiful features. She stood before the window, looking out upon the shadow-bathed valley. She saw before her the dark wall of foliage which rose to the heights of the front hill. Not a living soul was about, only was there a rising wind which disturbed the unbroken forest of pines. She turned abruptly from the view, as though she could not bear the solitude which was thus made so apparent. She crossed over to where the bookcase stood against the wall, and glanced in through the glazed doors. But she comprehended nothing of what she saw. She was thinking, and her mind was in a tumult of hysterical fancies. And she was listening, too, listening for a sound, any sound other than that which the wind made. Mechanically she came over to the table and leant against it in an attitude of abstraction. She shivered. She stood up to steady herself, and she shivered again. And all the time the frenzied eyes gleamed in their beautiful oval setting, the lips were drawn inwards, and there remained only a sharp defined line to mark the sweet mouth. Presently her lips parted, and she moistened them with her tongue. A fever seemed to be upon her, and mouth and throat were parched. Suddenly the sound for which she waited came. She darted eagerly to the window, and saw Chintz pass round in the direction of the barn. Then she saw the burly figure of the man she was awaiting appear in the clearing fronting the house. George Iredale came along at a robust gait. He was clad in moleskin riding breeches, much stained with clay, as though he had been digging. A soft shirt, the sleeves of which were rolled up above the elbow, his Stetson hat was adjusted to the correct angle upon his head, and he wore a pair of tan-coloured field boots, much smeared with the signs of toil. He came rapidly towards the house. There was nothing furtive, nothing guilty about this man's bearing. He came readily to meet his visitor, and his appearance was the confident bearing of a man who has little to fear. She saw him look towards the window where she stood, and his smile of welcome set her nerves tingling with a sensation she failed to understand. Her hand went round to the pocket of her linen riding skirt, and remained there. She heard him step in the hall. She heard him approach and turn the door handle. As he came into the room, she faced him. "Why, Prudence, this is delightful," he began, but she interrupted him coldly. "One moment," she said, and her voice was hoarse with the dryness of her throat. "I have not come over for any visit of pleasure, but strictly upon a matter of business. There are some explanations which we both need to make, but more especially you." "Yes." Iredale was gazing earnestly into the face before him. He was trying to fathom the meaning of her coldness. For the moment he wondered. Then slowly he began to understand that Hervey had been at work. "You got my note," he said, choosing to ignore the result of his observations. My delay in calling at the farm was unavoidable. I am in the midst of disposing of my ranch. I had not expected that I should have been called upon to do so soon. I beg that you will forgive me what must seem an unwarrantable delay." Prudence's nerves were so strung that she felt as though she could strike him for his calm words. Her condition demanded the opposition of passion equal to her own. His coolness maddened her. So long had she dwelt upon the accusation Hervey had brought against him that she believed in this man's guilt. The evidence of her own senses had militated against him, and now she steeled herself in an armour of unbelief. But in spite of herself, the dictates of her heart were struggling hard to find the joints of her armour. Nor were the struggles lessened now that she stood confronting him. His coolness, though maddening to her, was not without effect. The moral influence he wielded was great. She backed to the table, then she plunged into the subject of her mission without further preamble. Her eyes stared straight into his, and her tones sounded incisively in the stillness of the room. "I little knew the man whom I was listening to when he offered me his life, nor had I an idea of how near I was to the man who inspired the words which have appeared in the paper, the words which were the last Leslie Grey ever uttered. What must have been your feelings when I told you that I knew their author to be a murderer?" Then, with scathing bitterness, "But your feelings must have long since been dead as the poor creature you so wantonly sent to his reckoning. The time has come for you to defend yourself, that is, if defence you can offer. No flimsy excuse or extenuation will cover you. Even the Scriptures teach us that the penalty is a life for a life. Yours is the hand that struck Leslie down, and now you must face the consequences of your wanton act." Iredale's quiet eyes never attempted to avoid the girl's direct gaze, nor did he flinch as the accusation fell from her lips. Never was he more alert, never more gently disposed towards this half-demented creature than at that moment. He recognized the hand that had been at work, and he laid no blame upon her. His feelings were of sorrow for the woman he loved, and sorrow for himself, but his thoughts were chiefly for her. He knew, as she had said, that his time had come. "So Hervey has been to you to sell the discovery which I rejected at the price he asked. He told you that I was a smuggler, that the announcement in the paper was mine. And did he tell you that I was the murderer of Leslie Grey? Or did your heart prompt you to that conclusion?" The girl supported herself against the table with one hand, and the other was still in the pocket behind her. Iredale noted these things without moving his eyes from her face. "Hervey told me the facts and the inevitable proof they bore. Nor was his statement exaggerated. My own reason told me that." The man sighed. He had hoped that the work had been only of the brother's doings. He had hoped that she had come bearing Hervey's accusations and not her own. "Go on," he said. "I know you for what you really are, George Iredale, and now I have come to you to give you the chance of defending yourself. No man must be condemned without a hearing. Neither shall you. The evidence against you is overwhelming. I can see no escape for you. But speak, if you have anything to say in your defence, and I will listen. I charge you with the murder of Leslie Grey." Just for one brief moment Iredale felt a shiver pass through his body. The icy tones of the girl's voice, the seemingly dispassionate words, filled him with a horror unspeakable. Then he pulled himself together. He was on his defence before the one person in the world from whose condemnation he shrank. He did not answer at once. He wished to make no mistake. When at last he spoke, his words came slowly, as though he weighed well each syllable before he gave it utterance. "With one exception, all that Hervey has doubtless said of me is true. I am a smuggler. I inspired that line in the paper. But I am no murderer. Leslie Grey's life was sacred to me at the time, if only for the reason that he was your affianced husband. I loved you at that time, as I have loved you for years, and all my thoughts and wishes were for your happiness. It would have made you happy to have married Grey, Therefore I wish that you should marry him. I am quite unchanged. I will tell you now what neither you nor Hervey knows, even though it makes my case look blacker. I knew that Grey was on my track. I knew that he had discovered my secret. How he had done so I cannot say. He quarrelled with me, and, in the heart of his anger, told me of his intentions. It was late one night, at a card party at your house, and just before he was so foully murdered. No doubt you, or any right-minded person for that matter, will say that this evidence only clinches the case against me. But, in spite of it, I assert my innocence. Amongst my many sins, the crime Hervey charges me with — he purposely avoided associating the charge with her — is not numbered. Can I hope that you will believe me?" The gentle tones in which the burly man spoke, the earnest fearlessness which looked out from his quiet eyes, gave infinite weight to all he said. Prudence shook her head slowly, but the fire in her eyes was less bright, and the voice of her own heart crying out began to make itself heard in the midst of her chaotic thought. She tried to stiffen herself for the task she had undertaken, but the result was not all she sought. Still she replied coldly: "How can I believe, with all the black evidence against you? You, in all this region, were the one man interested in Leslie's death. His life meant penitentiary to you. His death meant liberty. Your own words tell me that. How can I believe such a denial as you now make? Tell me, have you no proof to offer? Account for the day on which Leslie met his death. Prove your movements upon that day." The girl's denial of belief was belied by the eagerness in her voice. For one brief instant a flash of hope rose in her. She saw a loophole for her lover. She longed to believe him. But the hope died down, leaving her worse distracted for its coming. For Iredale did not speak, and his face assumed a look of gloom. "Ah, you cannot, you cannot!" she went on hysterically. "I might have known. I did know." A world of passion again leapt into her eyes. Then something of the woman broke through her anger, and a heart-breaking piteousness sounded in her voice. "Oh, why did you do this thing? Why did you stain your hands with such a crime as murder? What would his living have meant to you, at worst the penitentiary? Was it worth it to destroy thus the last chance of your immortal soul? Oh, God, and to think of it! A murderer!" Then the fierce anger became dominant once more. "But you shall not escape. Your crime shall be expiated as far as human crimes can be expiated. The gallows awaits you, George Iredale, and your story shall be told to the world. You shall hang, unless you give to judge and jury a better denial than you have given to me." She suddenly broke off. A whistling, indrawn breath startled the man before her. She gazed round her wildly. She had remembered what she had come for. She had forgotten when she had talked of judge and jury. Her face assumed a ghastly hue at the recollection. Her eyes alone still told of the madness that possessed her. Nor was Iredale without an uneasy feeling at what he saw. That catch of breath, that hunted look as she gazed about the room. Intuition served him in the moment of crisis. What was the meaning? Why was that hand concealed in her dress? There was only one possible answer to such questions, and he read the answer aright. "Prudence," he said, in his deep musical voice, whilst his keen eyes riveted her attention, "I can prove my innocence of the crime you charge me with. Listen to me patiently, and I will tell you how. Do not let your anger drive you to any rash act which might bring you lifelong regret." The girl made a sharp ejaculation, but she did not attempt to interrupt him. "I can prove that I was not within 300 miles of this place on the day of Leslie's death," the man went on. "That I was in the city to the west of here, distributing," bitterly, "my wares. I can prove all this to you, and I intend that before you leave me to-day you shall be a witness to my innocence, even against all prejudice. But before judge and jury it will be different, very different," he sighed. "There I cannot prove my innocence, for to do so would be to betray my comrades, those who have traded with me and trusted me, and send them to the penal servitude which only awaits me." His eyes had become reflective. He seemed to be talking to himself now rather than to the woman before him. "No, I cannot save myself at such a cost. Even to escape the gallows I will not play the part of Judas." The woman made no reply. She stood staring at him, with all that was best in her shining in her eyes. She was trying to follow his every word and to take his meaning, and the one thought which dominated her whole mind was his expressed ability to prove his innocence to her. He seemed to awake from some melancholy reverie, and again his eyes sought hers. "Do you wish me to prove my innocence?" "Yes, you must. You shall." The girl moved from the table, and for the first time during the interview her hand was removed from the pocket in her skirt. Hope filled the heart in which but now the fires of hell had seemed to burn. She drank in his words with soul-consuming thirst. The proof, that was what she required. Iredale went on with grave gentleness. "The proof is in here." He moved to the bookcase and opened a secret recess in the back of it. "In this cupboard." He produced a pile of books and brought them to the table. Picking out one, he opened it at the date of Grey's death. It was a diary. He read out the entries for the entire week, all of which bore out his testimony. Every one was dated at a different town or village, and related to his sales of opium. He then opened another book and showed the entries of his sales and the figures. He went through the whole pile, book after book, and all of them bore out his statement as to his whereabouts. Then he produced several contracts. These were deeds between himself and various traders, and were dated at the towns at which they were signed. Each book and paper he passed on to Prudence for her scrutiny, drawing her attention to the corroboration in the evidence. There could be no doubt as to the genuineness of these facts, and the girl's last shadowy doubts of his innocence evaporated before the overwhelming detail. The hope which had filled her heart was now replaced by a triumphant joy. This man had shown her, had convinced her, and she wanted nothing more at that moment. She looked up into his face, hoping to see a reflection of her own happiness in it. But there was no happiness there. His face was calm, but the melancholy had deepened in his eyes. What she saw came like an icy douche to her, and the happy expression died upon her lips. She suddenly remembered that he had said he could not use this evidence to publicly declare his innocence. "But," she began. He shook his head. He knew that she wished to protest. For a moment they looked into each other's eyes. Then the woman, the weaker, broke down under the strain. Tears came to her eyes, and she poured out all the pent-up grief of her hours of misery. "Oh, George," she cried, "can you ever forgive my wickedness? I ought never to have believed. My heart told me that you were innocent, but the evidence, oh, the evidence! I could see no loophole. Everything pointed to you. And I, wretch that I am, I believed." And the girl sobbed as though her heart would break. Iredale made no attempt to soothe her. He felt that it would be good for her to weep. She leant against the table, and after a while her sobs quietened. Then the man touched her upon the shoulder. "Don't cry, Prue. My heart bleeds for you when I listen to your sobs. You're not to blame for believing me guilty. 12 jurymen will shortly do the same, and who can blame them?" He shrugged. "I must face the music and take my chance. And now, child," he added, his hand still resting upon her shoulder, and smiling down upon her from his superior height, "give me that which you have concealed in your pocket. We will throw it away." Prudence sprang up and moved beyond his reach. "No, no, I can't. Don't ask me. Spare me the shame of it. As you love me, George, don't ask me for it." "As you will, dear. I merely wish to rid ourselves of an ugly presence. While we are together, and it may not be for long now, nothing should come between us, least of all that." The girl's tears had dried. She looked over at her lover. His compelling influence was upon her. She paused irresolute. Then she plunged her hand into her pocket and drew forth a large revolver. "Here, take it. Take it and do what you like with it." Then she laughed bitterly.
You know me as I am now. I brought that to shoot you with, and afterwards to shoot myself. You see, I am a murderess at heart." And she smiled bitterly. Iredale took the weapon and placed it in his bookcase. Then he came to the girl's side and put his arm tenderly about her shoulders. "Forget it, child. Forget it as you would a hideous dream. Your feelings were forced upon you, while through my wretched doings that which I have done to gain wealth has brought only what might have been expected in its train. No work of evil is without its sting, and as is always the case, that sting seeks out the most sensitive part of its victim. The chastisement for my wrong-doing has been inflicted with cruel cunning, for you, Prue, have been made to suffer. Thus is my punishment 100-fold greater." He drew her to him as he spoke, and gently smoothed her dark hair. Under the influence of his touch and the sound of his voice the girl calmed. She nestled close to his side, and for a moment abandoned herself to the delight of being with him. But her thoughts would not remain idle for long. Suddenly she released herself and moved to arm's length from him. "George," she said in a tone of suppressed eagerness, "they cannot try you for murder. You will tell them. You will show them all these. For my sake, for the sake of all your friends, you will not let them condemn you. Oh, you can't allow it. Think," she went on more passionately, "no men would willingly let you be declared guilty when they know you to be innocent. It must not be." Iredale gave no outward sign. He had turned his face away and was gazing in the direction of the window. His reflective eyes looked out upon the valley, but his resolve was written plainly in them. "Do not tempt me, Prue," he said quietly. "Were I to do otherwise than I have resolved, and obtained an acquittal thereby, I should live a life of utter regret. I should despise myself. I should loathe my own shadow. Nothing could be more revolting to me than the man who plays the part of a traitor, and were I that man, life would be impossible to me. Think of it only for one moment, sweetheart, and your own good heart will tell you how impossible it is, that which you ask me to do. It cannot be. All the world would despise me. But even so, its utmost execration would be nothing compared with my own feelings at the thought that I had saved myself by such methods." He withdrew his hand from her embrace. "No, when the time comes and I am forced to stand my trial for Grey's murder, I shall face it. Nor shall I betray my friends by one single word. And, too, when that time comes, there will not remain one single trace of the traffic which has hitherto been part of my very existence. There shall be no possible chance of discovery for those who have trusted me. Your brother Hervey will never hold his hand. I know that. I realized that when he left me after seeking blackmail. His vindictive nature will see this through. And perhaps I would rather have it so. It will then be settled once and for all. I may get off, but I fear that it will be otherwise." At the mention of her brother's name Prudence started, and the blood receded from her anxious face, leaving it ghastly in its pallor. She had forgotten that he was even now on his way to Winnipeg for the express purpose of denouncing Iredale. For one instant she shook like an aspen. Then she recovered herself. What was to be done? She tried to think. This matter of Hervey was of her doing. She had driven him to it, urged him to it. Now she realized the full horror of what her foolish credulity had led her into. It had been in her power to stay his hand, at least to draw his fangs. Now it was too late. Suddenly she turned upon her lover in one final appeal. At that moment it seemed the only chance of saving him. "George, there is a way out of it all. One last resource, if you will only listen to me. You love me even in spite of the way I have wronged you. You belong to me if only by reason of our love. You have no right to throw your life away when you are innocent. God knows I honour you for your decision not to betray your companions. If it was possible, I love you more than ever. But the sin would be as great to throw your life away for such a shadow as it would be to deliver your friends up to justice. You can save yourself. You must. The border is near. We are right on it. Surely the way you have brought the Chinese into the country should provide an exit for us. Oh, my poor love, will you not listen to me? Will you not give me the life I crave? George, let us go together." Her words came passionately. She had stepped forward and placed her two brown hands upon his great shoulders,
and her dark, earnest eyes gazed lovingly up into his. The temptation was a sore one, and the man found it hard to resist. He experienced a sudden rush of blood to the brain. His body seemed to be on fire. He was pulsating with a mad passion. The thought of what she suggested came near to overthrowing his sternest resolve. To go with her, to have her evermore by his side. The thought was maddening. Surely he had never realized until that moment how dearly he loved this woman. But his strong nature came to his rescue in time. The passion had died down as swiftly as it had risen, and left him cold and collected. He gazed down into the brown eyes ever so kindly, ever so lovingly, and his answer came in a tone so gentle that the girl felt that whatever the future might hold for them, this moment had been worth living for. "No, no, sweetheart, not flight, even though you would be my companion. We love one another dearly, and for that very fact I could never allow myself to remain under this cloud. At all costs we will have the matter cleared. I owe it to you, to those at the farm, and to myself." The girl's hands dropped to her sides and she turned away. Then all the agony of her soul found vent in one exclamation. "Oh God!" she cried, and with that last cry came the revealing flash which answered the question she had so repeatedly asked herself. She turned back to her lover, and the agonized expression of her face had changed, and in her eyes was the eager light of excitement. Iredale saw the change, but did not recognize its meaning. He felt that she must no longer remain there. "Child, I want you to go back to the farm and tell them of the accusation that has been brought against me. Tell them all the circumstances of it. Tell them that I have clearly convinced you of my innocence, but as you love me, I charge you not to reveal the manner in which it was done. Tell your mother that I shall come over to morrow, and she shall hear the whole story from my lips. I wish to do this that she may hear my version before she reads of what must happen in the papers. After that I shall go into Winnipeg and set the law in motion. I will clear myself or otherwise. But on your honour you must promise that all I have shown you to-day remains a secret between us." Prudence listened intently to all he said, but a quiet look of resolve slowly crept into her eyes. "I promise," she said, and Iredale thanked her with a look. There was the briefest of pauses, then she went on. "On one condition." "What do you mean?" Iredale looked his surprise. "Now you must hear me, George," she went on eagerly. "You have charged me with this thing. You must abide by my time. A day more or less can make little difference to you." "But I wish to give myself up before others can make the charge." "Just so. And in the meantime I want your promise not to come to the farm until the—" she paused to make a swift mental calculation. "Day after to-morrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon." "Tell me your reason." "That is my own." The girl was smiling now. Then she again became excited. "Promise, promise, promise. There is no time to lose. Even now I fear we are too late." Iredale looked dubiously at her. Suddenly he saw her face darken. "Promise," she demanded fiercely, "or I will not abide by my promise to you." "I promise." An expression of relief came into Prudence's eyes, and she stepped towards him and looked up into his face. "Good-bye, George dearest." The man suddenly clasped her in a bear-like embrace and rained passionate, burning kisses on her upturned lips. Then quietly she released herself. She stood away from him, holding one of his great hands in both of hers. "Quick, now my horse!" Iredale departed, and Prudence was left alone. She stood looking after him, thinking. "Can I do it?" she asked herself. Damside City was the nearest telegraph station. It lay nearly 35 miles due west of Owl Hoot. It was merely a grain station for the district, and in no sense a village. She must make that point, and so intercept Hervey with a telegraphic message. It was her one chance. In spite of her lover she would buy Hervey's silence, and trust to the future to set the rest straight. She was strong, and her horse was good. She must reach the office before it was closed at 6 o'clock that evening. She calculated it up, and she had just 3 hours in which to cover the distance. She looked out of the window. The wind was blowing from the east. That was good. It would ease the horse. She looked up at the sky. There was a few clouds scudding westwards.
"Yes, I'll do it," she said at last, "if it kills poor Kitty." A moment later Iredale returned with the mare. The girl waited not a second. Her lover assisted her into the saddle reluctantly. He did not approve of this sudden activity on the part of the girl. When she had settled herself she bent down, and their lips met in one long, passionate kiss. "Good bye, George." The man waved his adieu. His heart was too full to speak. She swung her mare round and galloped down the valley to the north. Her object was to clear the valley and then turn off to the west, on the almost disused trail to Damside. Iredale looked after her until the sound of the mare's hoofs died away in the distance. He was filled with wonder at her strange request and her hurried departure, but his speculations brought to him no definite conclusions, and he turned abruptly and called to his man Chintz. The man hurried from the stable. "We have been a little delayed. Is everything ready?" Iredale looked up at the sky, then down at the grizzled face before him. Chintz nodded. "Good. Then get to work. Start the first fire directly beyond the graveyard to the east. The wind is getting up steadily. You are sure there are no farms to the west of us, between here and Rosy River?" The man gave a negative shake of the head. "That's all right, then. There will be no damage done, and the river will cut the fire off. This time to-morrow we shall be homeless wanderers, Chintz, you and I." And the smuggler laughed bitterly. Then his laugh died out. "Well, to work. Set the fires going." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 18. The Forest Demon Pursues. Prudence swung her mare out onto the overgrown trail to Damside City. Kitty was a trim-built little bronco, compact, well-ribbed, and with powerful shoulders and chest. She was just the animal to stay and travel fast. The road cut through the heart of the Owl Hoot bush and ran in a diagonal direction southwest towards the border. Then it converged with the border trail which skirted the great southern muskeg, and passing through a broken, stony country, went on to Damside. The wind was rapidly freshening, and the scudding clouds were quickly changing from white to grey, which, to the girl's practised mind, indicated an immediate change of weather. But she thought little of the matter beyond being thankful that the wind was well behind her. She wished to travel fast, and a fair wind is as necessary to the horseman under such circumstances as it is to the mariner. For a time the roughness of the road required her attention. Kitty was sure-footed, but the outstanding roots with which her path was lined needed careful negotiation. Presently the trail became wider and its surface more even, and signs of recent usage became apparent. The roots were worn down and the projecting stones had been removed. Neither did it take the girl long to decide whose servants had done these things. On this obscure trail were to be seen many signs of the traffic upon which the owner of Lonely Ranch had been engaged. Now Prudence gave Kitty her head, and the mare travelled at a great pace. The breeze had chastened the laden air of the pine world. The redolent woods no longer scented the air, which had in consequence become fresh and bracing. For the moment the emergency of her journey had dulled the girl's sensibilities to her surroundings. She looked out upon the beautiful tinted world, but she heeded nothing of what her eyes beheld. Her mind was set upon the object of her journey, and her thoughts were centred round the players in the drama of her life. How different her life seemed to have suddenly become from that which she had contemplated that morning. A great triumphant joy was with her, since her lover had established his innocence to her. Her troubles and anxieties were still many, and the least thing might upset every hope she entertained, but there was always with her the remembrance that George Iredale was innocent, and in that thought she felt a wonderful security. That he was a smuggler was a matter of insignificance. She loved him too well to let such knowledge narrow her estimation of him. She was too essentially of the prairie to consider so trifling a matter. Half the farmers in the country were in the habit of breaking the customs regulations by cutting wood and hay on government lands without a permit, and even hauling these things from across the border when such a course suited them.
and in every case it was contraband, but they were thought no less of by their friends. Iredale was no worse than they, in spite of the fact that his offence carried with it a vastly heavier sentence. But for the dread that she might be too late to intercept her brother, Prudence would almost have been happy as she raced along that westward bound trail. She knew her brother's nature well. She knew that he was vindictive, and no doubt her own treatment of him had roused his ire and all the lower instincts of his malignant nature. But she also knew that he loved money, needed money. His greed for gold was a gluttonous madness which he was incapable of resisting, and he would sacrifice any personal feeling provided the inducement were sufficiently large. She meant that the inducement should be as large as even he could wish, and she knew that in this direction his ideas were extensive. Her one trouble, the one thought which alarmed her, was the question of time. If the office were closed when she arrived, her journey would have been in vain, for the operator lived in Ainsley and would have gone home. Hervey would have arrived in Winnipeg, and by the time the office opened the following morning the mischief would have been done. She flicked her mare with the end of her reins and touched her flank with her heel. Kitty responded with a forward bound. The increased speed was all too slow for the rapid thought and deadly anxiety of the girl, but she was too good a horsewoman to press the willing beast beyond a rational gait. The hardy mare propped jerkily as she passed down the sharp side of a dried-out slough. She plunged through a thicket of long grass, and a grey cloud of mosquitoes rose and enveloped horse and rider. The vicious insects settled like a grey cloth upon the heated mare, and Prudence's soft flesh was punctured by hundreds of venomous needles at once. The girl swept the insects from her neck and face, heedless of the torturing stings. The mare fretted and raced up the opposite slope, while the girl leant forward in her saddle and sought to relieve the staunch little creature's agony by sweeping the poisonous insects from her steaming coat. The mare pressed on. Suddenly she threw up her head and snorted violently. Prudence was startled. Something had distracted Kitty's attention, and her wide-set eyes were cocked in alarm. Her nose was held high, and again she snorted. In consequence her pace was slackened and became awkward. She no longer kept a straight line along the trail, but moved from side to side in evident agitation. Prudence was puzzled, and endeavoured to steady the creature, but Kitty was not to be easily appeased. She rattled her bit and mouthed it determinedly, grabbing at the side bar with an evident desire to secure it in her teeth. The girl kept a tight rein and attempted to soothe her with the tender caress of her hand. But her efforts were unavailing. The ears were now turned backwards, and had assumed that curiously vicious inclination which in a horse is indicative of bad temper or equine terror. Kitty had no vice in her, and Prudence quickly understood the nature of her mare's feelings. The failure of her soothing efforts alarmed the girl. She sat up and looked about her. In the dense forest there seemed to be no unusual appearance. The trees were waving and bending in the wind, and their groanings had a sadly mournful effect upon the scene, but otherwise there was nothing strange to be observed. The sky had assumed a leaden hue, and in this direction the prospect was not alluring, but the clouds were fairly high, and there was no suggestion of immediate storm. Suddenly a couple of jackrabbits darted across the road. The mare propped, reared, and swung round toward the trees. Prudence brought her up to work sharply. Then she saw that the rabbits were racing on ahead, down the trail. For the moment her patience gave way, and she dug her heel hard against Kitty's side, and the mare plunged forward. But her gait remained unsteady, and in her agitation she kept changing her stride, and once even tripped and nearly fell. A coyote, followed by his mate and two young ones, ran out onto the trail and raced along ahead of her. They did not even turn their heads to look at her. Further on a great timber wolf appeared and trotted along the edge of the woods, every now and then turning its head furtively to glance back. Then, quite suddenly, Prudence became conscious of something unusual. She raised her face to the grey vault of the sky and sniffed at the air. A pungent scent was borne upon the wind. The odour of resinous wood, so strong as to be sticky, came to her,
and its pungency was not the ordinary scent of the forest about her. Half a dozen kit foxes dashed out onto the trail and joined in the race, and the yowl of the prairie dog warned her that other animals were about. The resinous odour grew stronger every moment, and at last Prudence detected the smell of smoke. She turned her head and looked back, and behind her, directly in her wake, she saw a thin grey haze which the wind was sweeping along above the trees. She drew her mare up to a stand, and as she sat looking back, a deadly fear crept into her eyes. Kitty resented the delay and reared and plunged in protest. The restraint maddened her. And all the time the girl saw that the smoke haze was thickening, and some strange distant sounds like the discharge of heavy ordnance reached her. The sweet oval face wore a strained expression. Her eyes were wide open and staring, and the fear which looked out of them was fear of no ordinary danger. She watched the dull haze as it thickened and rolled on towards her. She saw it rise like great steam jets and wreathe itself upwards as fresh volumes displayed the lower strata. She saw the dull brown tint creep into it as it densified, and she knew that it was smoke. The rest needed no explanation beyond the evidence of her senses. The sickly resinous smell told her what had happened. The forest was on fire. The thought found vent in a muttered exclamation, then came an afterthought. And the wind is blowing straight along behind me. For a moment she gazed about her wildly. She looked to the right and left. The forest walls were impassable. She looked back along the trail. The narrow ribbon-like space was filled with a fog of smoke which was even now enveloping her. What should she do? There was nothing for it but to go on. But the fire must be travelling apace in the high wind. Still she stood. It seemed as though for the moment her faculties were paralysed with the horror of her discovery. But at last she was moved to action. The mare became troublesome. The girl could no longer keep her still. The distracted animal humped her back and began to show signs of bucking. Then came a rush of animals along the trail. They came racing for dear life, and their numbers were augmented from the wooded depths which lined their route. Antelope led the way, their heads thrown up, and antlers pressed low down upon their backs as they seemed to fly over the sandy soil. Then came the loping dogs, coyotes, prairie wolves. Birds of all sorts assembled in one long continuous flight. The animal kingdom of that region of forest seemed to have become united in their mutual terror. Wolf and hare, coyote and jackrabbit, hawks and blackbird, prairie chicken and grey owl, all sworn enemies in time of calm prosperity, but now, in their terror, companions to the last. And all the time, in the growing twilight of smoke, came the distant booming as of the discharge of great cannon. The girl leaned forward. She clapped her heel hard against the mare's side, and with a silent prayer joined in the race for life. She had no exact knowledge of how far these woods extended, or where the break would come which should cut off the fire. The wild beasts were spreading on down the trail, and with the instinct of her prairie world she reasoned that in this direction alone must lie safety. The smoke grew denser and more choking. Her eyes became sore. Under her she felt the mare stretching herself to the utmost of her gait. She came up with many of the racing denizens of the forest, but they did not attempt to move off the trail at her approach. They were beyond the fear of human presence. A more terrible enemy was behind them, pursuing with gigantic strides which demolished space with incredible swiftness. Every moment the air grew hotter in spite of the mare's best efforts, and Prudence knew that the fire was gaining. Hill or dale made no difference now. It must be on, or the devouring monster would be upon them. Kitty never flagged, and with increasing speed her footing became even more sure. A loose line, with body bent well forward to ease the animal, Prudence did all she knew to assist her willing companion, but for every stride the faithful mare took, she knew that the fire was gaining many yards. The booming had increased to a steady roar, in the midst of which the deep thunderous detonations came like the peals of raging storm. The wind rushed headlong forward. the fire bringing with it an almost cyclonic sweep of heated air. The mighty forest giants about her bent like reeds under the terrible force, and shrieked aloud their fears at the coming of the devouring demon. The mare rushed down into a wide hollow. A culvert bridged a reedy slough. The affrighted beast raced across it. The stream of the animal world swept on about her. She breasted the steep ascent opposite, and Prudence was forced to draw rein. She dared not allow the horse to race up such an incline, even though the fire were within a quarter of a mile of her. She would have been mad to exhaust the faithful creature, which was now her only hope. Even the poor forest creatures, mad as they were with terror, slackened their gait. At length the hilltop was gained, and a long descent confronted them. Kitty showed no signs of exhaustion yet, and faced her work amidst the rush of refugees with all her original zest. Down into the valley they tore, for the worst of all perils was in pursuit. The valley stretched away far into the distance. Ahead, here in this hollow, the air was clearer. The hill had shut off the fog of smoke for the moment. The refugees now had a smooth run, and a faint glimmer of hope gladdened the heart of the girl. Without slackening her speed, she looked back at the hill, fearing to see the ruthless flames dart up over the path which her mare's feet had so recently trodden. But the flames had not yet reached the brow, and she sighed her satisfaction. The smoke was pouring over the tree tops, and circling and rolling in a tangled mass, was creeping down into her wake, but as yet there were no flames. She looked this way and that at the dark green of the endless woods, the gracious fields of bending pines. She thought of the beauty which must soon pass away, leaving behind it only the charred skeletons, the barren, lifeless trunks which for years would remain to mark the cruel path of flame. Suddenly the roar, which had partly died away into a vague, distant murmur beyond the hill, burst out again with redoubled fury. Again she looked round, and the meaning was made plain to her. She saw the yellow fringe of flame as it came dancing, chaotic, a tattered ribbon of light, upon the brow of the hill. She saw the dense pall of smoke hovering high above it, like the threat of some dreadful doom. The black of the forest upon the summit remained for a second, then over swept the red gold fire, absorbing all, devouring all, in an almost torrential rush down to the woods below. And now she beheld a sea of living fire as the hills blazed before her eyes. It was as though the whole place had been lit at one touch. The sea rolled up with incredible swiftness as the tongues of flame licked up the inflammable objects they encountered. The efforts of her mare became puerile in comparison with the fearful pace of the flames. How could she hope to outstrip such awful speed? On raced the mare, and on came the molten torrent. Now the heat was intolerable. The girl leant limply over her faithful horse's neck. She was dizzy and confused. Every blast of the wind burnt her more fiercely as the fire drew nearer. She felt how utterly hopeless were her horse's efforts. The mare faltered in her stride. It was her first trip. The girl shrieked wildly. She screamed at the top of her voice like one demented. Her nerves were failing, and hysteria gripped her. Kitty redoubled her efforts. The fear of the fire was aggravated by the girl's wild cries, and she stretched herself as she had never done before. Now it seemed as though they were racing in the heart of a furnace. The whole country was in flames, and the roar and crashing of falling timber was incessant, and the yellow glow was everywhere, even overhead. Blinded, dazed, the girl was borne on by the faithful Kitty. She no longer thought of what was so near behind her. What little reason was left to her she centred upon keeping her seat in the saddle. An awful faintness was upon her, and everything about her seemed distant. Kitty alone fought out the battle of that ride. Her mistress was beyond all but keeping upon the faithful animal's back. Had she been less exhausted, the girl would have seen what her mare saw. She would have seen the broad stream of the Rosy River ahead, and less than a quarter of a mile away. But she saw nothing. She felt nothing. She cared for nothing but her hold upon the saddle. This it was that when she came to the riverside, and the mare plunged from the steep bank into the deep, quick flowing stream, she knew not what had happened, but with a strange tenacity she held to the pummels of the saddle while her loyal friend breasted the waters. How they got out of the river Prudence never knew, nor did she fully realize all that had happened when at last the horse and rider again stood on firm ground, and the tough little broncho had covered another mile or more before the girl awoke to the fact that they were now in an open prairie country and skirting the brink of the great southern muskeg. Then it all came back to her, and as Kitty kept steadily on, she looked fearfully about her. She saw away in the distance the awful pall, the lurid gleam of the flames, and a heartfelt prayer of thanksgiving went up from that lonely trail for the merciful escape which had been hers. The girl leant over her mare's shoulder and caressed the foaming neck. "Good Kitty, faithful little mare," she exclaimed emotionally. Then she looked ahead and she remembered all. "But on, girl, on! There is more to do yet." The telegraph operator at Damside was closing up his little shack. He had just disconnected his instrument and was standing in his doorway gazing out across the prairie to the east, watching the vast clouds of smoke belching from the direction of the woods. All about him was a heavy haze, and a nasty taste of smoke was in his mouth. He looked across to the only other buildings which formed the city of Damside, the grain elevator and the railway siding buildings. His own hut was close beside the latter. The men were leaving their work. Then presently he looked back in the direction of the distant fire. "'Tain't the prairie," he muttered. "Too thick. Guess the woods are blazing. That's beyond the Rosy. Can't cross there, so I reckon there's no danger to us. The air do stink here. Guess I'll go and get my hand car and vamoose." He turned back to the room and put on his hat. Just as he left his doorway to pass over to where his hand car was standing on the railway track, he brought up to a halt. A horse and rider were racing up the trail towards him. "Hullo, what's this?" he exclaimed sharply. "Maybe it is the prairie." Prudence drew rein beside him. She had seen her man and she knew that she was in time. Her joy was written in her face. "My, but I've had a time!" she exclaimed, as she slid down from her saddle. "I thought that fire had got me. Call up Winnipeg, please, Mr. Francis." "Why, Miss Malling, have you ridden through that?" asked the operator, pointing to the distant smoke. "Not through it, but with it distinctly hot upon my heels, or rather my mare's," the girl laughed. "But I want you to send a message for me. It isn't too late for Winnipeg?" "Late? Bless you, no. But what is it? Prairie or forest?" "Forest," replied the girl shortly. "Where's a form?" They passed into the hut. Prudence proceeded to write out her message, while the man connected up Winnipeg and carried on a short conversation. "Bad fire," he said. "Very." Prudence began to write. "Just where?" "Owl Hoot." "River'll stop it." "Yes." "Good." Prudence went on writing. "Iredale's ranch burnt out?" The girl started. "I don't know." "Must be." "Oh." Then, "Here you are, and do you mind if I wait for an answer?" "Pleasure." And the man read the message. "To Hervey Malling, Northern Union Hotel, Winnipeg. Return at once. Money awaiting you. Willing to pay the price on your arrival. Do not fail to return at once. The other matter can rest. Prudence." The operator tapped away at the instrument. Hervey was sitting in the Northern Union Hotel smoking room. He was talking to a burly man with a red face and a shock of ginger grey hair. This was the proprietor of the hotel. "How long can you give me? I can settle everything by this day month. The harvesting is just finished. I only need time to haul the grain to the elevator. Will that satisfy you?" The big man shrugged. "You've put me off so often, Mr. Malling. It's not business, and you know it," he replied gutturally. "Will you give me an order on your crop?" He looked squarely into the other's face. Hervey hesitated. He knew that he could not do this, and yet he was sorely pressed for money. However, he made up his mind to take the risk. He thought his mother would not go back on him. "Very well."
He turned as the bellboy approached. "Telegram for you, sir. Expressed." Hervey took the envelope and tore it open. He read his sister's message, and a world of relief and triumph lit up his face. "Good," he muttered. Then he passed it to his companion. "Read that. Do you still need a mortgage? I shall set out to night." The hotel proprietor read the message, and a satisfied smile spread over his face. It did not do for him to press his customers too hard. But still he was a business man. He, too, felt relieved. "This relates to—" "An outlying farm of mine which I have now sold." "Your promise will be sufficient, Mr. Malling. I thought we should find an amicable settlement for our difficulty. You start to night?" "Yes." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 19. The Avenger. Alice was standing at the gate of the little front garden. She was talking to her lover, who had just ridden up from the direction of Owl Hoot. Rob had not dismounted, and his face was very serious as he leant down towards her. "And I never knew a word about it. It's a jolly good thing I obtained the delivery of his bunch of cattle when I did, or goodness knows what would have happened. Well, anyhow, I've lost a nice lump. My client, when he heard about the place being for sale, wanted to buy it for a back country for his beeves to winter in. Just my confounded luck. I knew there was a big fire out this way, but I never thought that Iredale was the unfortunate victim. Now I've got to go over to Lakeville to see him. He's staying there, you know, since he was burnt out. I'll come back this way, and if Mrs. Malling can put me up for the night, I'll be grateful. My plug won't stand the journey back home. You say Hervey will be along this evening?" "Yes," replied the girl. Then seriously, "What are you going to do?"
"Interview him. There are things about that dog that want explaining. I take it he can explain 'em. I don't easily forget, and I owe someone a deal more than I've been able to pay. P'raps that dog'll help me discharge my debt. Good-bye, Al. I must be off or I shan't get back this afternoon." Rob turned away in his cheerful, debonair manner and rode off. Troubles sat lightly on his stout heart. His effervescent nature never left him long depressed when Fortune played her freakish tricks upon him. He had lost his commission upon the sale of Iredale's land, but he had secured the better deal of the cattle. Therefore he was satisfied. But Rob was a very persistent man in his seemingly haphazard fashion. He had promised himself an interview with Hervey about his dog. He had never forgotten or forgiven the disaster in the mountains, and he believed that Hervey would be able to set him on the track of Zachary Smith, whom he felt certain he had seen at the Winnipeg depot. He hoped so, and for this purpose he intended to spend the night at Loon Dyke Farm. As her lover rode away, Alice turned back to the house. The anxious look was still upon her face. She knew that there was serious trouble in the family, and she could see no way of helping these people she loved. Prudence was in sad disgrace with her mother. She had been absent from the farm for 2 days, and had only returned that morning. Mrs. Malling had been distracted with anxiety and grief until the reappearance of her daughter, and then, when she saw that she was well and that no accident had happened to her, she had flown into such a terrible passion that even Prudence had quailed before her. Never in her life had Alice seen the kindly old soul give way to such rage. No disparaging epithet had been too bad for her child, and she had literally chased the girl from the room in which they had met. Since then Prudence had retreated to her bedroom, and Hepzibah had poured out the vials of her wrath upon an empty kitchen, for even the long-suffering hired girl had feared to face her. Now, as Alice approached the front door again, she heard the sound of high-pitched voices coming from the kitchen. Sarah Gurridge had come over while the farm wife's anger was at its height, and as Alice listened, she thought these two old cronies were quarrelling. But her ears quickly told her that her surmise was wrong. She heard Prudence's voice raised in angry protest, and instead of entering the house, she discreetly withdrew, passing round to the farmyard instead. In the kitchen a stormy scene was being enacted.
Prudence was standing just inside the door. Her mother was beside a long table on which were laid out the necessaries for pastry making. She had faced round upon the girl and stood brandishing a rolling pin in one hand, and in the other she held a small basket of eggs. Sarah was seated in a high-backed Windsor chair. Her arms were folded across her waist, and her face expressed perplexed alarm. Prudence's face was aflame, nor were her eyes one whit less angry than her mother's. "But I say you shall hear me, mother, whether you like it or not. I'll not let you or anyone else call me the filth which you did this morning for nothing." The girl's voice was hoarse with nervous feeling. Mrs. Malling shook her rolling pin in a perfect fury. "Out of this kitchen, you baggage! Out of it, do you hear me? Go and get your garments packed up, and out you go into the street. Child o' my flesh, are you? Out o' my house, you drab, or I'll be doing you a harm. I'll teach the like o' you to be stopping out o' nights, and then to come back without a word of explaining. I'll teach you." "Give the child a hearing, Hepzibah," said Sarah in her soft, even tones, as there came a lull in the angry mother's tirade. Prudence shot a grateful glance in her preceptor's direction. Hepzibah turned swiftly on the peaceful Sarah, but the words of anger which hovered upon her lips remained unspoken. Sarah was an influence in the old lady's life, and long association was not without effect. She visibly calmed. Prudence saw the change and took advantage of it. "How could I explain when you wouldn't listen to me?" she exclaimed resentfully. "Almost before I could say a word you called me all the shameful things you could think of. You drove me to silence when I was willing to tell you all. I was more than willing. You must know all, for the story I have to tell as nearly affects you as it does me. I stayed away from home to save an innocent man from the dreadful charge of murder, and your son from perpetrating the most wanton act of his worthless life." A dead silence followed her words. Hepzibah stared at her with an expression of stupefied amazement, while Sarah turned in her chair with a movement which was almost a jolt. The silence was at last broken by the girl's mother. "Murder? Hervey?" And there was no understanding in her tone. Her mind seemed to be groping blindly, and she merely repeated the two words which struck her most forcibly. "Yes, murder and Hervey," Prudence retorted. "Hervey has accused George Iredale of the murder of Leslie Grey. Now will you listen to my explanation?" Hepzibah precipitated herself into a chair. The rolling pin was returned to its place upon the dough board with a clatter, and the basket of eggs was set down with a force that sorely jeopardized its contents. "Yes, girl, tell me all. Let me hear what devil's work my Hervey's been up to. La sakes! And George Iredale a murderer!" And Prudence, her anger evaporated as swiftly as her mother's, told the two old ladies of her love for Iredale, and how he had asked her to be his wife. She told them how Hervey had come to her with the story of his discovery, how, after attempting to blackmail his victim, he had offered his information to her at a price, how she forced him to prove his case, and had sent him to Winnipeg with that object, how she had been nearly distracted, and eventually made up her mind to go and see Iredale herself, how the accused man had established to her his innocence beyond any doubt, and how he had shown her how impossible it would be for him to use the same means of clearing himself in a court of law. She dwelt upon each point so that these two, who were so dear to her, should not fail to understand as she understood. Then she told them how, recognizing George's danger, she had resolved to intercept Hervey, and, with her mother's assistance, pay him off, and finally how she had been overtaken by the forest fire, and how, her mare exhausted, had arrived at Damside in time to send her message to her brother, and how, failing any other means of returning home, she had taken shelter with the elevator clerk's wife until her mare had recovered and she was able to resume her journey to the farm. It was a long story, and the many interruptions of her mother gave the girl much extra trouble in the telling, but with a wonderful patience, born of her anxiety for her lover, she dealt with every little point that puzzled her audience.
When the story was finished its effect was made curiously manifest. The one thing which seemed to have gripped her mother's intensest feeling was the part her boy had played. Her round eyes had grown stern, and her comely lips had parted as her breath came heavy and fast. At last she burst out with a curious mixture of anger and sorrow in her words. "Bones of my Silas, flesh of my flesh, and to think o' the like! My Hervey a whelp of hell, a bloodsucker. Oh, that I should ha' lived to see such a day!" And she rocked herself, with her hand supporting her head and her elbows planted upon her knees. "Oh, them travellin's in foreign parts! My poor, poor Silas! If he'd jest lived long enough to git round our boy with a horsewhip, we might ha' been spared this disgrace. Prudence, girl, I'm that sorry for what I've said to you." Tears welled in the old eyes, which had now become very wistful, and slowly rolled down the plump cheeks. Suddenly she gathered up her apron and flung it up over her head, and the rocking continued dismally. Prudence came over to her and knelt at her side, caressing her stout figure in sympathy. Sarah sat looking away towards the window with dreamy eyes. The old schoolmistress made no comment. She was thinking deeply. "Don't cry, mother," said Prudence, with an ominous catch in her voice. "Whatever Hervey's faults, he will reap his own punishment. I want you to help me now, dear. I want you to give me the benefit of your experience and your sound practical sense. I must see this through. I have a wicked brother and an obstinate lover to deal with, and I want you to help me, and tell me what is best to do." The apron was removed from Mrs. Malling's head, and her eyes, red and watery, looked at the girl at her side with a world of love in their depths. "These two men will be here this afternoon," the girl went on. "George is coming to tell you his story himself, that you may judge him. He declares that, come what may, he will not rest with this shadow upon him. In justice to us, his friends, and to himself, he must face the consequences of his years of wrong-doing. Hervey will be here for his money. This is the position, and, according to my reckoning, they will arrive at about the same time. I don't quite know why, but I want to confront Hervey with the man he accuses. Now tell me what you think." "I'm thinking you make the third of a pack of foolheads," said the farm wife gently. "George is no murderer. He's not the killing sort. He's a man, he is. Then why worrit? And say, if that boy o' mine comes along, he'll learn that them Arctic goldfields is a cooler place for his likes than his mother's farm." The old woman's choler was rising again with tempestuous suddenness. "Say he's worse'n a skunk, and a sight more dangerous than a greaser. My, but he'll learn something from them as can teach him." "Yes, mother," replied the girl a little impatiently, "but you don't seem to see the seriousness of what he charges." "That I do, miss. Am I wanting in understanding? George is as innocent as an unborn babe, so what's the odds along o' Hervey's accusing? It don't amount to a heap o' corn shucks. That boy ain't responsible, I tell ye. He's like to get locked up himself in a loony 'sylum. I'll give him accusing." "But, mother, that won't do any good. He must be paid off." "And so he shall, child. There's more dollars in this farm than he reckons on, and they're ready for using when I say the word. If it's pay that's needed, he shall be paid, though I ain't just understanding the need." Sarah's voice broke in at this point. "The child's right, Hepzibah. There's money to be spent over this thing, or I'm no judge of human nature. Hervey's got a strong case, and from what the story tells us, George is a doomed man if he goes before the court. Innocent he may be, innocent he is, I'll wager, but if he's obstinate, he's done for." The farm wife made no reply, but sat gazing wistfully before her. "Yes, yes," Prudence said earnestly. "It is just the money, nothing more. We must not let an innocent man suffer. And, Aunt Sarah, we must prevail upon George to let us stop Hervey's mouth. That is our chief difficulty. You will help me, you and mother. You are so clever, Aunt Sarah. George will listen to you. Oh, we must must save him, even against himself." Sarah nodded her head sagely. She was deeply affected by all she had heard, but she gave no outward sign. "Child," she replied, "we will do our best for him, for you. But yours is the tongue that will persuade him best. He loves you, child, and you love him. He will not persist if you are set against it." "I hope it will be as you say," replied Prudence dubiously. "But when he comes you will let him tell his story in his own way. You will listen patiently to him. Then you can laugh at his determination and bring your arguments to bear. Then we will keep him until Hervey arrives, and we will settle the matter for ever. Oh, mother, I dread what is to come." Mrs. Malling did not seem to be paying much heed, but as the girl moved away from her side she spoke. There was no grief, no anger in her voice now. She spoke quite coldly, and Sarah Gurridge looked keenly over at her. "Yes, girl, we'll settle this rumpus, and Hervey." Prudence moved towards the door. She turned at her mother's words. "I will go upstairs," she said. "I want to think." She opened the door and nearly fell over the dog Nesh, who was standing outside it. There was a fanciful suggestion of the eavesdropper about the creature. His attitude was almost furtive. He moved slowly away and walked with the girl to the foot of the stairs, where he laid himself down with a complacent grunt. The girl went up to her room. "This day's doin's will be writ on my heart for ever," said the farm wife plaintively, as the door closed behind her daughter. "And see you, Hepzibah, and let no eyes read of them, for there will be little credit for any one in those same doings," said Sarah solemnly. Mrs. Malling hugged herself and again began to rock slowly, but there was no signs of tears in her round, dark eyes. Now and again her lips moved, and occasionally she muttered to herself. Sarah heard the name Hervey pass her lips once or twice, and she knew that her old friend had been sorely stricken. As the time for Iredale's arrival drew near, Prudence became restless. Her day had been spent in idleness as far as her farm work was concerned, and she had chosen the companionship of Alice, and had unburdened her heart to her. But sympathetic and practical as her friend was, she was quite unable to help her. As 4 o'clock drew near, however, Alice did the only thing possible. She took herself off for a walk down the Lakeville trail. She felt that it was better for everybody that she should be away while the trouble was on, and besides, she would meet her lover on his way to the farm, and give him timely warning against making his meditated stay for the night. At the appointed hour there came the clatter of a pacer's hoofs at the front gate, and a moment later Prudence led her lover into the parlour. After a few brief words she hurriedly departed to summon her mother and Sarah. There was a significant solemnity in this assembling, nor was it lessened by the smuggler's manner. Even the wolfish Nesh seemed impressed with what was happening, for he clung to the girl's heels, following her wherever she went, and finally laid down upon the trailing portion of her skirt when she took up her position beside her lover and waited for him to begin. The opening was a painful one for everybody. Iredale scarcely knew how to face those gentle folk and recount his disgraceful story. He thought of all they had been to him during his long years upon the prairie. He thought of their implicit trust and faith in him. He almost quailed before the steady, honest eyes of the old people. However, he at last forced himself to his task, and plunged into his story with uncompromising bluntness. "I am accused of murder," he said, and paused, while a sickly feeling pervaded his stomach. Mrs. Malling nodded her head. She was too open to remain silent long. "Of Leslie Grey," she said at once. "And ye needn't be telling us nothing more, George. We know the yarn you are about to tell us. And d'ye think we're going to believe any addle-pated scallywag such as Hervey agin you? Smuggler you may be, but that you've sunk to killing human flesh, not even a minister o' the gospel's going to convince me. Here I respects the man I give my hand to. Shake me by the hand, George, shake me by the hand." And the farm wife rose from her chair and ambled across the room with her hand outstretched. Iredale clasped it in both of his, and never in his life had he experienced such a burst of thankfulness as he did at that moment. His heart was too full to speak. Prudence smiled gravely as she watched this whole-hearted token of her mother's loyalty to a friend. Nor was Sarah backward in her expression of goodwill. "Hepzibah's right, George, and she speaks for both of us. But there's work to be done for all that. Hervey's to be dealt with." "To be bribed," said Hepzibah uncompromisingly, as she returned to her seat. Iredale shook his head, and his face set sternly. Prudence saw the look she feared creep into her lover's eyes. She opened her lips to protest, but the words remained unspoken. She had heard the rattle of a buckboard outside. The sound died away, and she knew that the vehicle had passed round to the barn. She waited in an agony of suspense for her brother's appearance. "You needn't to shake your head," went on the farm wife. "This matter's my concern. It's my dollars as is going to pay Master Hervey, and when he gets 'em, may they blister his fingers, I says." Prudence heard a footstep in the hall. The crucial moment had arrived, and her heart palpitated with nervous apprehension. Before Iredale could reply the door was flung open, and Hervey stood in their midst. Instantly every eye was turned upon him. He stood for a moment and looked round. There was a slight unsteadiness in his attitude. His great eyes looked wilder than ever, and they were curiously bloodshot. At least one of the three ladies possessed an observant mind. Sarah saw that the man had been drinking. To her the signs, though slight, were unmistakable. The others did not seem to notice his condition. "Ah," he said, with an attempt at pleasantry, "a nice little party. Well, I've come for the dibs." His eyes lit upon the figure of George Iredale, and he broke off. The next moment he went on angrily. "What's that man doing in this house?" he cried, his eyes fiercely blazing with sudden rage. "Is the place turned into a refuge for murderers?" The man's fury had set fire to the powder train. His mother was on her feet in a twinkling. Her comfortable body fairly shook in her indignation. Her face was a flaming scarlet, and her round eyes sparkled wickedly. "And who be you to question the calling of my house, Hervey Malling?" she cried. "Since when comes it that you've the right to raise your voice against my guests? And by what right d'ye dare to accuse an innocent man? Answer me, you imp of evil," she demanded. But she gave him no time to speak, and went on, her voice rising to a piercing crescendo. "Spare your wicked tongue, which should be forked by reason of the lies as has fallen from it. Oh, that you should be able to call me mother! I'd rather mother the offspring of a rattlesnake than you. What have you done by us all your life but bring sorrow and trouble upon those who've done all that which is in them to help you? Coward! Traitor! And you come now with lies on your tongue to harm an innocent man that's done you no harm." She breathed hard. Then her wrath swept on, and the room rang with the piercing pitch of her voice. "You've come for your blood money, your 30 pieces. You villain! If your poor father were alive this day, he should lay a rawhide about you till your bones were flayed. Sakes, I've a mind to set about you myself. Look at you, the black heart. Look at him. Was ever such filth of a man? And him my son. Blood money, and to think that I'm living to know it." She paused. Hervey broke in. "Silence, you old fool. You don't know what you're talking about. That man," pointing over at Iredale, who sat waiting for an opportunity to interfere, "is the murderer of Leslie Grey. I suppose he's been priming you with blarney and yarns. But I tell you he murdered Grey. I'm not here for any tomfoolery. I got Prudence's message to say the money was forthcoming. Where is it? $15,000 buys me, and that I want at once. If I have any more yapping, I'll make it 20,000. He looked about him savagely, and his eyes finally paused on George Iredale, seated beside Prudence. He cared nothing for his mother's vituperation, but he was watchful of the smuggler. Suddenly the burly rancher sprang to his feet. He stepped up to Hervey. The latter moved a pace back. "Not 1 cent, you cowardly hound!" he roared. "Not 1 cent shall you have, do you hear? I thank God that I am here to stop you robbing these, your mother and sister." Mrs. Malling tried to interfere, but he waved her back. "I've come at the right time, and I tell you that you shall not take 1 cent of the money. I will never leave you, lest you should wheedle it from them. I will spoil your game. That is what I intend to do. You and I will set out for Winnipeg to night, and together we will interview the Commissioner of Police. Do you understand me? I have the whip in hand now, and I promise you your silence shall not be bought."
Prudence interfered. "Listen to me, George. I implore you not to do this thing. Hervey can have all he wants, everything. You are innocent, we know, but you cannot prove your innocence. Why should you break my heart when there is a way out of the difficulty? There is but one person who can denounce you, and his silence we can purchase. Oh, George," the girl went on passionately, "as you love me, listen. My heart will break if this thing you meditate comes to pass. Oh, my love, say you won't do it. Let mother pay the man off, that he may pass out of our lives for ever. See, mother is going for the money now. It is so easy, so simple." Mrs. Malling had risen from her seat and moved away to the door. Hervey stood at the far end of the parlour, facing the open window. He saw his mother pass out, and a great look of satisfaction came into his eyes. After all, these women meant to treat him fairly, he thought. He grinned over at Iredale. "Better drop it, Iredale, and don't play the fool. When I get the money I shall forget that I ever knew you." The smuggler was about to fire a swift retort when the sound of voices coming in at the open window interrupted him. The voices were a man's and a woman's. Prudence recognized Alice's tones. The others she did not recognize at once. Sarah Gurridge, who had been a silent observer of the scene, had heard the sound too, but she was absorbed in what was being enacted about her. Her eyes were upon Hervey. She saw him start, and his great haunting eyes were turned upon the window. Suddenly he rushed forward towards it. He had to pass round the table, close to where Prudence was now standing. In doing so he kicked against the dog, which was standing with its ears pricked up and its head turned in the direction whence the voices sounded. The man's evil face was blanched. A wild, hunted look was in his eyes. Iredale saw, was startled, and his reply died upon his lips as he wondered at this sudden change. "Shut the window, do you hear?" cried Hervey excitedly. "Don't let them hear! Don't let them—" He had reached the window to carry out his own instructions. His hands were upon the casements, and he was about to fling the glass frames together. But suddenly his arms dropped to his sides. He stood face to face with the figure of Rob Chillingwood. There was a dreadful silence. Then, slowly, Hervey backed away. His glaring eyes were fixed upon the stern countenance of the ex-customs officer. Slowly he backed from the apparition, and the onlookers noted the pallid cheeks and blazing eyes, and they wondered helplessly. Nor did Hervey pause until he reached the wall furthest from the window. Then he stood, and his lips silently moved. Suddenly there was a cry, and it rang with vengeful triumph. It came from the man at the window, Rob Chillingwood. "By God, it's Zachary Smith!" The next instant and he was in the room. The onlookers gazed blankly from one to the other of the two men. What did it mean? Who was Zachary Smith? And why did Rob so call Hervey? Then their eyes settled on the man against the wall. His cheeks were no longer pallid. They were flushed with a hectic colouring, and those strange eyes were filled with an awful, murderous light. The lips continued to move, but he did not speak. Only his right hand slipped round behind him. Then Rob's voice sounded through the room again. "So, Mr. Zachary Smith, we meet again. And by the Lord Harry, you shall swing for what you did in the mountains. Highway robbery of the government bullion under the charge of Leslie Grey, and the murder of our Indian guide, Rainy Moon." Then he turned. "Hold that door!" he shouted, and Iredale sprang to obey. "But—" Prudence rushed forward, but Sarah stopped her and drew her back. A wild laugh came from Hervey's direction. "And who's going to take me?" he cried. "You, Rob Chillingwood? You? Ha ha!" And his maniacal laugh rang out again. "Look to yourself, you fool. Grey crossed my path, and he paid for it with his life. You shall follow him." While his words yet rang upon the air, his hand shot out from behind him, gripping a heavy revolver. The pistol was raised, and a shriek went up from the two ladies. Suddenly there was a rush, a snarl, and a great body seemed to literally hurl itself through the air. A shot rang out. Simultaneously a cry echoed through the room. Hervey staggered as something seized him by the throat and tore away the soft flesh. Another shot followed. It all happened in a twinkling. Hervey fell to the ground with a gurgling cry, and Nesh, the dog until then forgotten by everybody, rolled over by his side with one dying yelp of pain. Then silence reigned throughout the room, and all was still. Iredale returned his smoking pistol to his pocket and went over to Hervey's side. His movements seemed to release the others from the spell under which they had been held. Rob, unharmed by Hervey's shot, came forward, and Sarah and Prudence followed in his wake, but Iredale waved the ladies back. "Stand away, please," he said quietly. "The dog had finished him before I got my shot in to save him. The brute has literally torn his throat out." Then he looked over at the dead hound. "It's awful. I wonder what made the dog turn upon him." "Are they both dead?" asked Rob in an awestruck voice. Iredale nodded. "It must have been the sight of Hervey's levelled pistol that made the dog rush at him," said Prudence. "I've seen him do so before." "Strange, strange," murmured Iredale. "The dog feared firearms," said Sarah. "Perhaps he had reason," observed Rob significantly. "He only has 3 sound legs. By God! And not content with his victims in the mountains, he But yes, I see it. This man came here without expecting to meet Grey or me." Rob broke off and looked at Prudence. "Of course, I'm beginning to understand. You and Grey were to have been married." Then he turned back to the contemplation of the dead bodies. "Yes, the murderer of Grey lies confessed," said Iredale quietly, "and I think that his motives were even stronger than those attributed to—" Prudence placed a hand over his mouth before he could complete his sentence. They were startled from their horrified contemplation of the work of those last few moments by the sound of Hepzibah's voice calling from her bedroom. The sitting-room door had been opened by Alice, who had entered the moment Iredale had released the handle. Now they could hear the farm wife moving about overhead, evidently on her way downstairs. Sarah was the first to recover her presence of mind. She turned upon Rob. "Not a word to her about—" Rob shook his head. Iredale snatched the pistol from the dead man's hand. Mrs. Malling's footsteps came creaking down the stairs. Suddenly Prudence's hands went up to her face as she thought of the shock awaiting her mother. Alice dragged her away to a chair. Iredale and Rob stood looking down at the 2 objects on the floor. Master and hound were lying side by side. Sarah ran to the door and met the farm wife. She must never know that her son was a murderer, a double murderer. Those within the room heard the schoolma'am's gentle tones. "No, no, Hepzibah, you must not go in there yet. There are things which you must not see. The hound has killed him. Hervey enraged the dog, and the wretched beast turned upon him, and he is dead." Then there came the sound of a scuffle. The next moment Mother Hepsy pushed her way into the room. She looked about her wildly. One hand was clutching a bundle of $100 bills. Suddenly her round staring eyes fell upon the 2 objects lying side by side upon the ground. She looked at the hound. Then she looked upon her son. Iredale had covered the torn throat with pocket handkerchiefs. The bills slowly fell in a shower from her hand, and her arms folded themselves over her breast. Then she looked in a dazed fashion upon those about her, muttering audibly, "He's dead. He's dead," she repeated to herself over and over again. Then suddenly she ceased her repetitions and shook her head. "Mussy o' me, mussy o' me, the Lord's will be done." And she slowly fell in a heap by her dead son's side. End of chapter 19. Section 20 of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Final section. In conclusion. Time, the great healer of all sufferings, all sorrows, can do much, but memory clings with a pertinacity which defies all time's best efforts. Time may soften the poignancy of deep-rooted sorrow, but it cannot shut out altogether the pain of a mother's grief at the loss of an only son. In spite of all Hervey's crimes he was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow.
The story of his villainies was rigidly kept from her, and so she thought of him only as a prodigal, as a boy to be pitied, as one whose offences must be condoned. She sought for his good points, and in her sweet motherly heart saw a wonderful deal in him on which to centre her loving memory, which, had he lived, even she could never have discovered. It is something that erring man has to be humbly grateful for, that women are like this, so full of the patient, enduring love which can see no wrong in the object of their affections. But Loon Dyke Farm became intolerable to Hephzibah Malling after the ghastly tragedy of her son's death, and when Rob and Alice saw fit to marry, urged on to that risky experiment by the two older ladies, she insisted upon leasing the place to them at ridiculously easy terms. She would have given it to them only for their steady refusal to accept such a magnificent wedding gift from her. The old lady was rich enough for her needs and her daughters, and, business woman as she was generous to a fault where her affections were concerned. Prudence, too, was satisfied with any arrangement which would take her away from the farm. Knowing what she knew of her brother, Loon Dyke could never again be her home. So mother and daughter retired to Ainsley, and only once again did they return to their old home, on the briefest of visits, and that was to assist at the function of christening the son and heir of the Chillingwoods. Later on, Prudence induced her mother to make Winnipeg her home, but though for her daughter's sake she acceded to the request, she was never quite at ease among her new surroundings. Nor was Sarah Gurridge, when she visited her old friend during her holidays, slow to observe this. "My dear," she told Alice one day after her summer vacation, "Hephzibah is failing fast. She's quite old, although she is my junior by 2 years and 3 months. An idle life doesn't suit her, and as for Prudence, she wears fine clothes and goes out in society all day and most of the night, but she's that thin and melancholy that you wouldn't know her for the same child. It's my opinion that she's pining. They are both pining. I found a letter from Hamilton when I got back home. It was from George Iredale, and I'm going to answer it at once." "And what are you going to say in your reply?" laughed Alice. "I know your matchmaking propensity. So does Rob." The quiet, dreamy face of the old schoolmistress smiled over at the happy mother. "Say," she exclaimed, "I'm going to give George a piece of my mind for staying away so long. I know why he's doing so, and my belief as to the cause of his absence is different from what Prudence is beginning to imagine. She thinks he has left her because of her brother's doings, and it's that that's driving her to an early grave. I shall certainly tell George what I think," and Sarah wagged her head sagely. And she was as good as her word. She had not seen fit to tell Alice that she had been in constant communication with George Iredale ever since the day of the tragedy, or that she was in his confidence as regarded Prudence. George had left the district to give both Prudence and her mother time to recover from the shock, and now that a year or more had passed away, he had written, appealing to Sarah to tell him if she thought the time auspicious for his return. In a long, carefully worded letter, Sarah advised him not to delay. "By dint of much perseverance," she wrote, "I have persuaded the child out of her absurd notions about the reflections her brother's doings have cast upon her. She looks at things from a healthier standpoint now. Why should she not marry? What has she done to debar her from fulfilling the mission which is appointed for every woman? Nothing. And I am sure if a certain man should return and renew the appeal which he made at the time when the Lord's anger was visited upon her brother, she would give him a different reply. However, I must not waste all my space upon the silly notions of a child with a misdirected conscience." And how her letter bore fruit, and how George Iredale returned and sought Prudence in the midst of the distractions of Winnipeg's social whirl, and how the girl's answer, when again he appealed to her, turned out to be the one Sarah had prophesied for him, were matters of great satisfaction to the sage old schoolmistress. She assisted at the wedding which followed.
She saw the bride and bridegroom off at the railway depot. She remained to console her old friend for the loss of her daughter. Then she hied her off once more back to the bleak staring schoolhouse, where she continued to propound sage maxims for the young of the district until her allotted task was done and the tally of her years complete. The End. End of The Hound from the North by Ridgwell Cullum. Read by Lisa Reichert, Winnipeg native.